Imagine a fire so vast, so consuming and so relentless that it burned for 6 months. Not 6 hours, not 6 days, not 6 weeks, 6 months. The flames fed on manuscripts, on palm leaf folios and birch bark scrolls, on volumes of philosophy, astronomy, medicines, logic, grammar, and poetry that had been accumulating for over 700 years. The smoke rose above the plains of northern India in a column that could be seen for miles. A dark signal marking the end of something that the world would not see again for centuries. The greatest centre of learning in the ancient world. The place was Nalanda. The year was approximately 1193 of the Common Era, and the destruction was carried out by an invading army that, according to the historical accounts, did not fully understand what it was destroying. The soldiers who set the fires were not scholars. They were not interested in the contents of the manuscripts they burned. They saw buildings, they saw monks, and they saw a fortified institution that they associated with the enemy. They burned it, and in doing so, they erased a library that had taken 7 centuries to build, a library that had drawn students and scholars from across the entire Asian continent, a library that contained, by some estimates, as many as 9 million individual manuscripts. 9 million manuscripts. The number is so large that it resists comprehension. The Library of Alexandria, the most famous lost library in Western history, is estimated to have contained somewhere between 40,000 and 400,000 scrolls at its peak. Even at the upper end of that estimate, Nalanda's collection would have been more than 20 times larger. The library was housed in a complex of 3 great buildings, multi-story towers, that were said to be so tall that their upper floors touched the clouds. One was called Ratnasagara, the Ocean of Jewels. The others were called Ratnadadi and Ratnaranjaka. Together, they constituted the Dharma Ganja, the treasury of truth. And for over 700 years, they held within their walls the accumulated wisdom of one of the most sophisticated intellectual traditions in human history. The destruction of Nalanda was not merely a military event. It was a civilizational catastrophe. It marked the effective end of organized Buddhist scholarship in India, the land where Buddhism was born. It destroyed a tradition of learning that had produced some of the most important philosophical, scientific, and literary works in the history of Asia. It severed the connections between Indian Buddhist thought and the wider Buddhist world, connections that had sustained a flow of ideas, texts, and scholars across the vast distances of the Asian continent for centuries. And it consigned to oblivion an unknown but certainly enormous body of knowledge that had been painstakingly collected, copied, studied, and debated by generations of the finest minds in the Buddhist intellectual tradition. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand what Nalanda was, what it contained, how it was built, and why its destruction represents one of the greatest losses of knowledge in human history. You are going to learn about the specific subjects that were studied within its walls, the specific scholars who walked its corridors, and the specific texts that were produced, preserved, and ultimately destroyed in the flames. You are going to see how the burning of Nalanda was not an isolated event, but the culmination of a broader pattern of destruction that swept across northern India at the end of the 12th century, a pattern that fundamentally altered the intellectual landscape of an entire continent. And you are going to confront a question that historians are still debating today. How much of what was lost at Nalanda is truly gone forever, and how much might still survive, scattered and fragmented in the libraries and monasteries of Tibet, China, Japan, and Southeast Asia? Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The fire that consumed the Library of Nalanda burned for 6 months. When it finally went out, the ashes covered a body of knowledge that had been 700 years in the making. The monks who had devoted their lives to studying and preserving that knowledge were dead, scattered, or in hiding. The buildings that had housed the greatest collection of Buddhist manuscripts ever assembled were reduced to ruins, and the silence that followed was so complete, so total, and so enduring that the very location of Nalanda was eventually forgotten, its ruins buried beneath centuries of vegetation and silt, waiting to be rediscovered by archaeologists in the 19th century. Now, let us begin. The manuscripts that burned at Nalanda were not ordinary documents. They were the products of one of the most sophisticated intellectual traditions in human history, a tradition that had spent 15 centuries refining its methods, deepening its insights, and expanding the boundaries of human understanding. The scholars who produced those manuscripts were not mere copyists. They were original thinkers, men and women of extraordinary intellectual ability, who devoted their lives to the pursuit of knowledge in all its forms, from the most abstract philosophical speculation to the most practical medical diagnosis. And the institution that housed those manuscripts was not merely a storage facility. It was a living, breathing intellectual community, a place where knowledge was not merely preserved but actively created, where old ideas were questioned and new ideas were generated, where the boundaries of the known were constantly being pushed outward by the combined efforts of thousands of dedicated scholars. The questions that the destruction of Nalanda raises are not merely historical. They are urgent, contemporary, and deeply personal. If a library of 9 million manuscripts, the work of 7 centuries of continuous intellectual effort, could be reduced to ash in a matter of months, what does that say about the security of the knowledge we produce and accumulate today? If one of the greatest intellectual traditions in human history could be effectively extinguished in a single generation, what does that say about the permanence of the traditions we take for granted? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones, and the story of Nalanda demands that we face them. To understand what was lost at Nalanda, we must first understand what was built there, and to understand what was built, we must understand the civilization that built it. Nalanda was not an accident. It was the product of a deliberate, sustained, and enormously ambitious effort by successive Indian dynasties to create and maintain a center of learning that would serve as the intellectual capital of the Buddhist world. That effort began in the 5th century of the Common Era, during the reign of the Gupta dynasty, and it continued for over 700 years through the reigns of the Pala dynasty and their successors, until the destruction of the institution by invading forces at the end of the 12th century. The site of Nalanda is located in the modern Indian state of Bihar, in northeastern India, not far from the ancient cities of Rajagriha and Pataliputra, which had been major centers of political and cultural power in the Indian subcontinent for centuries. The region was deeply associated with the life of the Buddha, who is said to have visited the area during his lifetime and to have delivered sermons in the mango grove of a local merchant named Pavarika. The name Nalanda itself is the subject of scholarly debate. One traditional etymology derives it from the Sanskrit na alam dar, meaning no end to the giving of knowledge, a fitting description for an institution that would become the most generous dispenser of learning in the ancient world. Another tradition associates the name with a serpent king called Nalanda, who was said to inhabit a nearby lake. The earliest monastic establishments at the site date to the 5th century, when the Gupta emperors, particularly Kumaragupta I, who reigned from approximately 415 to 455 of the Common Era, began patronizing the Buddhist monasteries that had grown up around the sacred sites of the region. The Guptas were not exclusively Buddhist. They were, for the most part, followers of Hinduism, who also patronized Jain and Buddhist institutions. But their support for Nalanda was substantial, and it laid the foundation for the institution's subsequent growth into the largest and most prestigious center of learning in Asia. The growth of Nalanda from a modest monastic community into a vast university complex occurred gradually over the course of several centuries. Successive rulers added new buildings, endowed new professorships, and donated land and revenue to support the institution's operations. The Pala dynasty, which ruled Bihar and Bengal from the 8th to the 12th century, were particularly generous patrons of Nalanda, and it was under their patronage that the institution reached the peak of its size, influence, and intellectual prestige. The Pala kings were devout Buddhists who saw the support of monastic institutions as both a religious duty and a source of political legitimacy. They built new monasteries, temples, and library buildings at Nalanda, endowed the institution with the revenues from hundreds of villages, and sent diplomatic missions to other Buddhist kingdoms to promote Nalanda as the preeminent center of Buddhist learning in the world. The physical scale of Nalanda at its peak was enormous. Archaeological excavations, which began in the 19th century and have continued intermittently to the present day, have revealed a complex of monasteries, temples, lecture halls, libraries, and support buildings that covered an area of approximately 12 hectares, roughly 30 acres. The monasteries were multi-story structures built of brick, arranged in neat rows around central courtyards. Each monastery contained individual cells for monks, communal halls for dining and study, and meditation rooms. The temples were elaborate structures decorated with sculptures and paintings that depicted scenes from the life of the Buddha and from the vast mythology of Mahayana Buddhism. The library buildings, the Dharmaganja, were the most imposing structures on the campus, multi-story towers that housed the institution's vast collection of manuscripts. The population of Nalanda at its peak is a subject of debate amongst historians, but the estimates are striking. The Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, who studied at Nalanda for approximately 5 years in the early 7th century, and who left the most detailed eyewitness account of the institution that has survived, reported that the university housed approximately 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers. The Chinese pilgrim Yi Jing, who visited Nalanda later in the 7th century, confirmed these general numbers. If these figures are even approximately accurate, Nalanda was one of the largest educational institutions in the world at that time, larger than any European university would be for centuries to come. The students who came to Nalanda were drawn from across the entire Buddhist world. Xuanzang himself had travelled from China, a journey that took him years and covered thousands of miles across some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth, including the deserts of Central Asia and the passes of the Hindu Kush Mountains. Other students came from Korea, Japan, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Java, Sumatra, and the kingdoms of mainland Southeast Asia. The presence of students from such a wide geographical range is testimony to Nalanda's reputation, which extended across the entire Asian continent, and which drew ambitious scholars from every corner of the Buddhist world. The curriculum at Nalanda was comprehensive, encompassing not only Buddhist philosophy and religious texts, but also what were known as the 5 sciences in the Indian intellectual tradition: grammar, logic, medicine, the arts, and inner science, which referred to the study of Buddhist philosophy and meditation. The breadth of the curriculum was unusual for a monastic institution. Nalanda was not merely a monastery where monks studied the scriptures of their tradition. It was a university in the fullest sense of the word, an institution where the entire range of human knowledge, as understood by the Indian intellectual tradition, was studied, debated, and transmitted. The study of logic at Nalanda was particularly advanced. The Indian logical tradition, which had developed independently of the Greek tradition, and which had its own distinctive methods and terminology, reached one of its highest points of development at Nalanda. The great logician Dharmakirti, who taught at Nalanda in the 7th century, produced a body of work on logic and epistemology that is considered one of the most important contributions to the philosophy of knowledge in any tradition. Dharmakirti's work on inference, perception, and the nature of valid knowledge influenced not only Buddhist philosophy, but also the philosophical traditions of Hinduism and Jainism, and it continues to be studied by philosophers today. The study of medicine at Nalanda drew on the ancient Indian medical tradition known as Ayurveda, which had been developing for centuries before the founding of the university. Ayurvedic medicine was a comprehensive system of healthcare that encompassed diagnosis, treatment, pharmacology, surgery, and preventive medicine. The medical texts studied at Nalanda included the classic Ayurvedic treatises attributed to Charaka and Sushruta, which described in detail the diagnosis and treatment of hundreds of diseases, the preparation of medicinal compounds from plant, mineral, and animal sources, and the principles of surgical practice, including the description of surgical instruments, anesthesia, and specific operative techniques. The study of astronomy and mathematics at Nalanda reflected the sophisticated tradition of Indian Mahafanatal thought that had produced, among other achievements, the concept of zero the decimal place value number system, and significant advances in algebra, trigonometry, and calculus. The great mathematician and astronomer Aryabhata, who worked in the late 5th and early 6th century, is sometimes associated with Nalanda, though the exact nature of his connection to the institution is debated. Whether or not Aryabhata himself taught at Nalanda, the mathematical and astronomical tradition that he represented was certainly studied there, and the institution's astronomers continued to make observations and calculations that contributed to the advancement of astronomical knowledge in India and across the Buddhist world. The study of grammar at Nalanda was grounded in the monumental work of Panini, the ancient Indian grammarian whose Ashtadhyayi, composed probably in the 4th century before the Common Era, is one of the most sophisticated linguistic analyses ever produced. Panini's grammar, which described the Sanskrit language in approximately 4,000 rules of extraordinary precision and economy, was the foundation of all subsequent linguistic study in India, and it was studied at Nalanda as an essential component of the intellectual training of every serious scholar. The study of Panini's grammar was not merely an exercise in language learning. It was a training in analytical thinking, in the ability to identify patterns, to construct rules, and to apply those rules systematically to complex phenomena, skills that were directly applicable to the study of logic, philosophy, and the sciences. The literary and philosophical output of Nalanda was vast. The scholars who taught and studied at the university produced commentaries on the Buddhist scriptures, original philosophical treatises, works of logic and epistemology, poems, hymns, and treatises on meditation and spiritual practice. Some of the most important figures in the history of Buddhist philosophy are associated with Nalanda, including Nagarjuna, the founder of the Madhyamaka school of Buddhist philosophy, whose concept of shunyata, or emptiness, is one of the most influential ideas in the history of Asian thought. Although Nagarjuna lived before the formal founding of Nalanda as a major university, the tradition that he established was central to the intellectual life of the institution, and his works were studied, debated, and commented upon by generations of Nalanda scholars. Other major figures associated with Nalanda include Asanga and Vasubandhu, the founders of the Yogacara school of Buddhist philosophy, Shantideva, whose Bodhicharyavatara, or Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, is one of the most beloved texts in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, Chandrakirti, whose commentary on Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka became the standard interpretation of Madhyamaka philosophy, and Atisha, the great Bengali scholar who travelled to Tibet in the 11th century and played a crucial role in the revival of Buddhism in that country. These are not obscure figures. They are among the most important thinkers in the history of Asian philosophy, and their works have influenced the intellectual and spiritual life of billions of people across the continent and beyond. The library that served this intellectual community was, by all accounts, the largest and most comprehensive collection of manuscripts in Asia. The Dharma Ganja, or Treasury of Truth, consisted of 3 great buildings, the Ratnasagara, or Ocean of Jewels, which was the largest and most important of the 3, the Ratnadadi, and the Ratnaranjaka. These buildings were multi-story structures, reportedly 9 stories tall, though the exact height is debated. They housed a collection of manuscripts that, according to traditional accounts, numbered in the millions. The manuscripts were written primarily on palm leaves, the standard writing material in India for over 1,000 years. Palm leaf manuscripts are made from the dried and treated leaves of the palmyra, or hot palm, which are cut into rectangular strips, inscribed with a stylus, and then bound together with cord passed through holes in the leaves. The resulting manuscripts are elegant and compact, but they are also fragile. Palm leaves are vulnerable to moisture, insects, and fire, and they have a limited lifespan under normal conditions. In the tropical climate of Bihar, where humidity and insect activity are both high, palm leaf manuscripts require regular copying and careful storage to ensure their survival. The monastic community at Nalanda maintained a continuous tradition of manuscript copying that was essential to the preservation of the library's contents. Scribes worked constantly to produce new copies of deteriorating manuscripts, ensuring that the texts survived from one generation to the next. The subjects covered by the library's collection mirrored the breadth of the university's curriculum. The collection included texts on Buddhist philosophy in all its major schools, including Madhyamaka, Yogacara, Abhidharma, and Vajrayana. It included texts on logic, epistemology, grammar, rhetoric, and debate. It included medical texts, astronomical treatises, mathematical works, and texts on the arts, including music, painting, and sculpture. It included the vast body of Buddhist scriptures, the sutras and tantras, that constitute the canonical literature of the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions, and it included commentaries, sub-commentaries, and independent treatises produced by the scholars of Nalanda itself over the course of 7 centuries of continuous intellectual activity. And this is where the story becomes deeply unsettling, because all of this, every manuscript, every commentary, every treatise, every copy of every text that had been carefully preserved by generations of monastic scribes, was destroyed in a single campaign of military conquest. The fire that consumed the Dharmaganja did not merely destroy a building, it destroyed the memory of a civilization. It erased the accumulated intellectual output of 700 years, and the loss was so complete, and the destruction so thorough, that we cannot even say with certainty what specific texts were lost, because the catalogues and inventories that might have told us were themselves consumed by the flames. The Vajrayana tradition, which became increasingly prominent at Nalanda during the Pala period, represents a particularly significant and particularly poorly understood dimension of the institution's intellectual output. The Vajrayana texts, known as tantras, describe complex systems of meditation, ritual, and yoga that integrate philosophical understanding with embodied practice. These texts were composed in a deliberately obscure style, using symbolic language and coded references that were intended to be understood only by initiates who had received proper instruction from a qualified teacher. The result was a literature that was both extraordinarily rich and extraordinarily difficult to interpret, a literature that required a living tradition of oral commentary to be fully understood. The loss of the Vajrayana literature at Nalanda was particularly devastating because the oral commentary tradition that was essential for the interpretation of these texts was also destroyed. The tantric texts that survive in Tibetan translation can be read and studied, but the full context of oral instruction that originally accompanied them is largely gone. Tibetan scholars developed their own traditions of tantric commentary, drawing on the instructions they had received from Indian teachers before the destruction, but these Tibetan commentarial traditions, however valuable, are inevitably shaped by the particular lineages and the particular interpretive perspectives that happen to be transmitted to Tibet, rather than by the full range of interpretive traditions that existed at Nalanda. The economic infrastructure that supported Nalanda's operations was itself a remarkable achievement. The 200 villages whose revenues were assigned to the university provided a stable and substantial income that funded not only the basic needs of the monastic community, but also the production of manuscripts, the maintenance of buildings, the hosting of visiting scholars, and the support of students who travelled to Nalanda from distant lands. This system of economic support created a virtuous cycle in which the intellectual prestige of the institution attracted patronage, and the patronage funded the intellectual activities that sustained the prestige. The disruption of this economic cycle through the decline of the Pala dynasty and the subsequent military conquest of Bihar was one of the proximate causes of the institution's vulnerability and its eventual destruction. The daily routine at Nalanda, as described by the Chinese pilgrims, was structured to maximize the time available for study and practice. The monks rose before dawn for meditation and prayer, followed by communal meals and periods of study. The afternoons were devoted to lectures, debates, and the individual study of texts. The evenings included additional meditation and, for advanced students, the study of the tantric practices that constituted the highest level of the curriculum. This structured routine, maintained consistently over many decades and centuries, created the conditions for sustained intellectual productivity that resulted in the vast body of literature that the library eventually contained. The role of women in the Nalanda tradition is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. While the majority of the inhabitants of Nalanda were male monks, there is evidence that women participated in the intellectual life of the institution in various capacities. The Vajrayana tradition, in particular, accorded an important role to female practitioners, and some of the most revered teachers in the tantric lineages were women. The extent to which women had access to the educational resources of Nalanda, including the library, remains unclear, but the evidence suggests that the institution was not exclusively male in its intellectual culture. The intellectual tradition that Nalanda served had its roots in the earliest period of Buddhist history. Buddhism emerged in the Indian subcontinent in the 5th century before the Common Era, and from its earliest days, the Buddhist community placed an extraordinary emphasis on the collection, the preservation, and the transmission of the teachings of the Buddha and his followers. The earliest Buddhist texts were transmitted orally, memorized and recited by generations of monks who served as living libraries, carrying the teachings in their minds and passing them on to their students through a rigorous system of communal recitation and correction. The transition from oral to written transmission occurred gradually, beginning in the 1st century before Common Era, when the Pali Canon was first committed to writing in Sri Lanka. Once the transition to written texts was underway, the Buddhist community invested heavily in the production, the collection, and the preservation of manuscripts, creating a literary tradition that would eventually become one of the most extensive in the world. The Mahayana Buddhist tradition, which emerged in the early centuries of the Common Era and which became the dominant form of Buddhism in India, Tibet, China, Korea, and Japan, greatly expanded the scope of Buddhist literary production. The Mahayana Sutras, which the tradition regarded as the word of the Buddha, revealed at a later stage of his teaching career, added thousands of new texts to the Buddhist canon. The philosophical schools that developed within the Mahayana tradition, particularly the Monogmachal school founded by Nagarjuna and the Yogacara school founded by Asanga and Vasubandhu, produced vast bodies of philosophical literature that explored the most fundamental questions of metaphysics, epistemology, and soteriology with a depth and a rigor that bear comparison with the greatest achievements of Western philosophy. The Vajrayana Buddhist tradition, which developed in India in the latter half of the 1st millennium of the Common Era, and which became the dominant form of Buddhism at Nalanda during the Pala period, added yet another layer to the Buddhist literary tradition. The Vajrayana texts, known as tantras, described elaborate systems of meditation, ritual, and yoga that were intended to accelerate the practitioner's progress toward enlightenment. These texts were often written in a deliberately obscure and symbolic language, and they required extensive commentary and oral instruction from a qualified teacher to be properly understood. The tantric literature produced at Nalanda and at the other great Indian monasteries was vast, and its loss in the fires of 1193 represents one of the most significant gaps in the surviving Buddhist literary tradition. The system of education at Nalanda was rigorous and demanding. Admission to the university was competitive, and prospective students were required to pass an entrance examination that tested their knowledge of Buddhist philosophy, logic, and Sanskrit grammar. The examination was administered by a gatekeeper scholar, and the standards were reportedly so high that only about 2 out of every 10 applicants were admitted. Once admitted, students followed a structured curriculum that progressed from introductory courses in grammar and logic to advanced studies in philosophy, meditation, and the specialized fields of the Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions. The method of instruction at Nalanda was primarily oral and dialectical. Lectures were delivered by senior scholars, and students were expected to memorize, analyze, and debate the material they had studied. Public debates, in which scholars from different philosophical schools argued their positions before large audiences, were a central feature of the intellectual life of the institution. These debates were conducted according to formal rules of logic and rhetoric that ensured the rigor and the fairness of the proceedings. A scholar who was defeated in debate suffered a significant loss of prestige, and the outcomes of major debates could influence the direction of philosophical thought across the entire Buddhist world. The material support for Nalanda's operations was provided through an elaborate system of endowments and patronage. The Pala kings assigned the revenues from approximately 200 villages to the support of the university, providing a stable source of income that funded the construction and maintenance of buildings, the provision of food and clothing for the monks, the purchase of writing materials, and the wages of the scribes who copied manuscripts. This system of royal patronage was essential to the survival of the institution, and its eventual withdrawal, as the Pala dynasty declined in power and was replaced by rulers with different priorities, was one of the factors that left Nalanda vulnerable to destruction. The international character of Nalanda was one of its most distinctive features. The university maintained connections with Buddhist communities across the entire Asian continent, and these connections facilitated a flow of ideas, texts, and scholars that was remarkable for its scale and its persistence. Scholars from Nalanda traveled to Tibet, China, and Southeast Asia to teach and to translate texts, while scholars from those regions traveled to Nalanda to study, to acquire manuscripts, and to participate in the intellectual life of the institution. This network of scholarly exchange was the primary mechanism through which Indian Buddhist thought spread across Asia, and its disruption by the destruction of the Indian monasteries had profound consequences for the development of Buddhist thought throughout the region. The library itself was not merely a passive repository of texts. It was an active center of scholarly production, where scribes worked continuously to copy manuscripts, where editors compiled and organized texts into collections, and where scholars produced new works that drew on the vast resources of the collection. The library also served as a center for the distribution of texts to other monasteries and libraries across the Buddhist world. Monks who visited Nalanda from distant lands were encouraged to copy texts and to carry them back to their home institutions, spreading the intellectual wealth of the collection across the entire Asian continent. This system of text distribution was one of the primary mechanisms by which Indian Buddhist literature reached Tibet, China, and other parts of Asia, and it explains why some of the texts that were lost in the destruction of Nalanda survive in translations that were made from copies that had been distributed before the library burned. The scale of the manuscript collection at Nalanda reflected the cumulative effect of 7 centuries of systematic acquisition and production. The library did not spring into existence fully formed. It grew gradually, as each generation of monks added to the collection through their own scholarly work and through the acquisition of texts from other sources. Visiting scholars brought manuscripts from distant monasteries. Royal patrons donated collections that they had assembled, and the scribes of Nalanda worked continuously, year after year, century after century, copying texts onto fresh palm leaves to replace manuscripts that had deteriorated and to produce additional copies for distribution to other institutions. The physical process of manuscript production at Nalanda was labor-intensive and time-consuming. A scribe working on a palm leaf manuscript would begin by selecting and preparing the leaves, a process that involved soaking the leaves in water, drying them, and then smoothing their surfaces to create a suitable writing surface. The scribe would then inscribe the text using a metal stylus, pressing the point into the surface of the leaf to create visible marks. After the inscription was complete, the surface would be rubbed with a mixture of charcoal or ink that filled the incised marks and made them legible. The finished leaves would be stacked, aligned, and bound together with cord pass-through holes drilled in the leaves. A single manuscript might contain dozens or hundreds of individual leaves, and the production of a complete copy of a major text could take weeks or months of sustained effort. The administrative organization of the library was sophisticated, reflecting centuries of institutional development. The library had its own staff of librarians and scribes who were responsible for the care, the organization, and the reproduction of the collection. The manuscripts were arranged according to subject, with different rooms or floors of the library buildings dedicated to different categories of text. The librarians maintained records of the holdings, tracked the condition of manuscripts, and prioritized the copying of texts that were in danger of deterioration. This administrative system, which had evolved over centuries of practice, was itself a form of institutional knowledge that was lost along with the physical collection when the library was destroyed. The interaction between Nalanda and the broader intellectual world of India was not limited to the Buddhist tradition. The university existed within a vibrant and competitive intellectual ecosystem that included Hindu, Jain, and secular scholars, as well as Buddhists. The great debates that took place at Nalanda often involved participants from non-Buddhist traditions, and the Buddhist philosophers of the institution were required to engage with and respond to the arguments of their Hindu and Jain counterparts. This competitive intellectual environment was one of the factors that drove the remarkable productivity and the remarkable sophistication of the Nalanda scholarly tradition. The Buddhist philosophers were not working in isolation. They were working in dialogue with some of the most brilliant thinkers of their age, thinkers who challenged their assumptions, exposed the weaknesses in their arguments, and forced them to refine and strengthen their philosophical positions. The competitive nature of the intellectual environment also meant that the Buddhist philosophers at Nalanda were constantly producing new work, new arguments, new treatises, and new commentaries that responded to the latest developments in Hindu and Jain philosophy. This continuous cycle of challenge and response, of critique and revision, drove the Buddhist philosophical tradition to ever higher levels of sophistication and produced a body of philosophical literature of extraordinary depth and subtlety. The loss of this literature at the burning of the library was therefore not merely the loss of a static collection of old texts. It was the loss of a dynamic, evolving tradition of philosophical inquiry that was still actively producing new knowledge at the time of its destruction. The influence of Nalanda on the development of educational institutions across Asia is another dimension of its significance that deserves attention. The architectural layout, the administrative structure, and the pedagogical methods of Nalanda served as models for the construction of Buddhist universities and monasteries throughout Asia. The Tibetan monastery of Samye, founded in the 8th century, was explicitly modelled on an Indian Buddhist institution, possibly Odantapuri. The great universities of Myanmar and Thailand drew on Indian models that were transmitted through the networks of Buddhist scholarly exchange that Nalanda had helped to create. The idea of the university itself, as a residential institution dedicated to the study and the transmission of knowledge across multiple disciplines, may have been transmitted from India to the Islamic world and from there to medieval Europe, though the specific channels of this transmission remain a subject of scholarly debate. The influence of Nalanda extended to the development of art and iconography across the Buddhist world. The artistic tradition that flourished at Nalanda during the Pala period, roughly the 8th through the 12th centuries, produced a distinctive style of bronze and stone sculpture that became one of the most influential artistic traditions in Asian history. The Pala-style images of the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas, characterized by their elegant proportions, their serene expressions, and their richly detailed iconographic attributes, were carried across Asia by monks and pilgrims who visited Nalanda, and they became the model for Buddhist art in Tibet, Nepal, Myanmar, Java, and other parts of Southeast Asia. The loss of the Nalanda artistic workshops, along with the destruction of the sculptures and paintings that decorated the campus, represented a significant loss for the history of Asian art, as well as for the history of Asian thought. The cosmopolitan character of the Nalanda student body reflected the institution's status as the premier center of Buddhist learning in Asia. Students who arrived at Nalanda from China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Java, and other parts of the Buddhist world found a community that was genuinely international, where scholars from diverse cultural backgrounds studied together, debated together, and exchanged ideas in ways that enriched the intellectual life of the institution and expanded the horizons of every participant. The destruction of Nalanda did not come without warning. The political situation in northern India in the late 12th century was one of increasing instability and vulnerability. The Pala dynasty, which had been the primary patron of Nalanda for centuries, had declined in power and was eventually replaced by the Sena dynasty, which, while not hostile to Buddhism, was primarily Hindu in orientation and did not provide the same level of support to the Buddhist monasteries that the palace had. The military power that had protected the great monastic institutions of Bihar and Bengal was weakening at precisely the moment when a new and formidable threat was emerging from the northwest. That threat was the military campaigns of the Turkic and Afghan armies that had been pushing into the Indian subcontinent from Central Asia since the early 11th century. The raids of Mahmud of Ghazni in the early 11th century had already demonstrated the vulnerability of Indian temples and monasteries to military attack, and the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in the late 12th century marked the beginning of a period of sustained military pressure on the traditional institutions of Hindu and Buddhist India. The Buddhist monasteries were particularly vulnerable because they were large, wealthy, and conspicuously identifiable, and because the monks who inhabited them were not warriors and could not defend themselves against armed attack. The specific destruction of Nalanda is attributed by the historical sources to Bakhtiyar Khilji, a Turkic military commander who led a campaign of conquest through Bihar in approximately 1193 of the Common Era. The primary source for the destruction is the Tabakat-i-Nasiri, a historical chronicle written by Minhaj-i-Siraj Jujjani in the 13th century. According to Minhaj's account, Bakhtiyar Khilji attacked a fortified place in Bihar that turned out to be a Buddhist monastery. The account describes how the invaders killed the inhabitants, most of whom were monks with shaved heads, and burned the extensive collection of books that they found within the complex. It was only after the destruction, according to Minhaj, that the invaders learned that the place they had attacked was a center of learning rather than a military fortification. The account raises troubling questions about the nature and the intent of the destruction. Was the burning of Nalanda a deliberate act of cultural destruction aimed specifically at the Buddhist intellectual tradition? Or was it, as Minhaj's account suggests, an act of military aggression carried out by soldiers who did not understand the nature of the institution they were attacking? The historical evidence does not provide a definitive answer. What is clear is that the destruction was thorough and that the consequences were devastating. The monks were killed or scattered, the buildings were burned or demolished, and the library, the vast collection of manuscripts that had been 700 years in the making, was consumed by fire. The scale of the fire is one of the most vivid and most haunting details in the historical accounts. Multiple sources state that the library burned for weeks or even months, a claim that becomes plausible when we consider the sheer volume of combustible material that the building contained. Millions of palm leaf manuscripts, stored on wooden shelving in multi-story buildings, would have provided an enormous quantity of fuel. The fire, once started, would have been virtually impossible to extinguish, particularly in the absence of any organized firefighting effort. The monks who might have attempted to save the manuscripts were dead or in flight. The soldiers who had set the fire had no interest in preserving the contents, and so the fire burned, consuming manuscript after manuscript, text after text, century after century of accumulated knowledge, until there was nothing left to burn. But here is the problem. We do not know, and we cannot know, exactly what was lost. The destruction of Nalanda was so complete that it destroyed not only the manuscripts, but also the records that might have told us what the manuscripts contained. We have no comprehensive catalogue of the library's holdings. We have no inventory of the subjects covered, the authors represented, or the texts included in the collection. What we know about the library's contents comes from indirect sources. The accounts of Chinese pilgrims who visited Nalanda before its destruction, the lists of texts that were translated from Sanskrit into Chinese and Tibetan before the library was burned, and the occasional references to specific works in the surviving writings of Nalanda scholars. The accounts of the Chinese pilgrims are the most detailed sources we have for the intellectual life of Nalanda before its destruction. Xuanzang, who studied at Nalanda from approximately 630 to 635 of the Common Era, left a detailed account of the university's curriculum, its methods of teaching, and the debates that took place among its scholars. His account describes a vibrant intellectual community where scholars from different Buddhist schools debated the most fundamental questions of philosophy, logic, and soteriology, the study of salvation and liberation. Xuanzang himself participated in these debates and reportedly won a major public disputation against a rival scholar, an achievement that brought him great renown throughout the Buddhist world. Xuanzang's account also provides information about the organization of the library and the methods used to preserve and transmit texts. He describes a system of manuscript production in which scribes worked continuously to copy texts, both for the use of the Nalanda community and for distribution to other monasteries and libraries across the Buddhist world. He notes that the library contained texts not only in Sanskrit, the primary scholarly language of Indian Buddhism, but also in Pali, the language of the Theravada Buddhist canon, and in various Prakrit dialects. The linguistic diversity of the collection reflects the breadth of the Buddhist literary tradition and the role of Nalanda as a center for the study and preservation of texts from multiple Buddhist schools and traditions. Yi Jing, who visited Nalanda several decades after Xuanzang, provides additional information about the daily life of the institution. His account describes the routine of the monks, which included periods of meditation, study, debate, and manual labor, as well as communal meals and religious ceremonies. Yijing was particularly impressed by the discipline and the intellectual rigor of the Nalanda community, which he described as the highest he had encountered in his extensive travels through the Buddhist world. His account confirms the picture drawn by Xuanzang of a vibrant, well-organized, and intellectually demanding institution that attracted the finest scholars from across Asia. The loss of the Nalanda library must be understood in the context of the broader intellectual tradition that the library served. Buddhism, by the time of Nalanda's destruction, had developed one of the most extensive and most sophisticated literary traditions in the world. The Buddhist canon, in its various recensions and translations, comprised thousands of individual texts, ranging from short sutras and verses to massive encyclopedic compilations that ran to hundreds of volumes. The commentarial tradition that had grown up around these canonical texts was even more extensive, comprising tens of thousands of individual works produced by scholars. Over the course of more than a millennium of intellectual activity, the philosophical schools of Buddhism, particularly the Madhyamaka and Yogacara schools, had developed systems of thought of extraordinary complexity and subtlety, systems that engaged with the most fundamental questions of metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and the philosophy of mind. And it gets worse. The Nalanda library did not contain only Buddhist texts. It contained texts from multiple Indian intellectual traditions, including Hindu philosophy, Jain philosophy, the Nyaya school of logic, the Vaisheshika school of atomist metaphysics, and the various schools of Sanskrit grammar and literary criticism. The library was, in effect, a comprehensive repository of the Indian intellectual tradition as a whole, not merely of the Buddhist component of that tradition. The destruction of the library therefore resulted in the loss of texts, not only from the Buddhist tradition, but from the broader Indian intellectual heritage, a heritage that encompassed some of the most original and most sophisticated philosophical, scientific, and literary achievements in the history of human thought. The impact of the destruction extended far beyond the immediate loss of manuscripts. It disrupted the networks of scholarly communication that had connected Nalanda to other centers of Buddhist learning across Asia. It destroyed the institutional framework, the teaching positions, the scribal workshops, the debating halls, and the administrative systems that had sustained the intellectual life of the university for centuries. It scattered the community of scholars whose collective expertise constituted a living repository of knowledge that no library, however large, could fully capture. The knowledge contained in the manuscripts was only part of what was lost. The other part, the oral traditions, the pedagogical methods, the debating techniques, the meditative practices, and the personal relationships between teachers and students that constituted the living intellectual tradition of Nalanda, was lost along with the manuscripts. And it was, if anything, even more irreplaceable. The destruction of Nalanda was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader pattern of destruction that affected Buddhist monastic institutions across northern India in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. The great monasteries of Vikramashila and Odantapuri, which had been major centers of Buddhist learning alongside Nalanda, were also destroyed during the same period of military conquest. The combined destruction of these three institutions effectively ended the organized Buddhist intellectual tradition in India, the land where Buddhism had been born and where it had flourished for over 1500 years. The monks who survived the destruction fled to Nepal, Tibet, and Southeast Asia, carrying with them whatever manuscripts and whatever knowledge they could salvage. But the institutional framework that had sustained the tradition for centuries was gone, and it would not be rebuilt. The scale of the loss is difficult to quantify, but the numbers are striking. If the traditional estimate of 9 million manuscripts is even approximately accurate, the burning of Nalanda would represent the single largest destruction of written knowledge in human history. Even if we reduce that estimate significantly, acknowledging the possibility of exaggeration in the traditional accounts, the loss would still be staggering. A collection of even 1 million manuscripts would represent a body of written knowledge that dwarfs any other ancient library for which we have historical evidence. And even if the actual number were in the hundreds of thousands, the destruction would still rank among the greatest losses of knowledge in the history of human civilization. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The burning of Nalanda did not merely destroy a collection of texts. It destroyed the last major repository of the Indian Buddhist intellectual tradition. Other libraries had existed in other monasteries and in other regions of India, but they too were destroyed or dispersed during the same period of conquest. The Nalanda library was the last and the largest, the final repository of a tradition that had been accumulating knowledge for over 1500 years. When it burned, the tradition burned with it. The texts that were lost at Nalanda were not merely copies of works that existed elsewhere. Many of them were unique. Many existed only in the Sanskrit originals that had been preserved at Nalanda and at the other Indian monasteries that were destroyed during the same period. When those originals burned, the texts they contained were lost forever, unless copies had been made and sent to libraries outside India before the destruction occurred. The destruction of Nalanda must also be understood in the context of the broader social and political changes that were transforming northern India in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. The military campaigns of the Turkic and Afghan armies were not merely destructive raids. They were part of a process of political transformation that resulted in the establishment of new political structures, new systems of patronage, and new cultural priorities. The Buddhist monasteries, which had been central to the intellectual and religious life of northern India under the Polar dynasty, did not fit into the new political and cultural order. They were large, wealthy, and conspicuous, and they were associated with a religious tradition that was unfamiliar and, in some cases, actively opposed by the new rulers. The destruction of the monasteries was therefore not merely an act of war. It was, in part, an act of cultural transformation, a clearing of the ground for the establishment of a new order. The vulnerability of the Buddhist monasteries was compounded by the fact that they had become increasingly dependent on royal patronage and increasingly isolated from the broader Indian society. In the centuries before the destruction, Buddhism in India had been gradually declining as a popular religion, losing adherents to the revived Hindu traditions that were becoming increasingly dominant in Indian social and cultural life. The Buddhist community had become concentrated in the monasteries, where it was sustained by royal patronage rather than by popular support. When the patronage was withdrawn, the Buddhist community had no popular base on which to fall back, and the monasteries, deprived of both protection and support, were defenseless against attack. The process by which the location of Nalanda was forgotten is itself a testament to the completeness of the destruction. Within a few generations of the burning, the site was abandoned, and its ruins were gradually reclaimed by vegetation and silt. The memory of the institution survived in the accounts of the Chinese pilgrims and in the traditions of the Buddhist communities that had received its teachings, but the physical location was lost. When Alexander Cunningham, the British archaeologist, identified the ruins in the 19th century, he did so by matching the geographical descriptions in Xuanzang's account with the features of the landscape in Bihar. The identification was confirmed by the discovery of inscriptions and seals bearing the name Nalanda at the excavated site. The archaeological excavations that have been conducted at Nalanda since Cunningham's initial identification have revealed a site of enormous extent and complexity. The excavated area, which covers only a fraction of the total site, includes the foundations of at least 11 monasteries and 6 temples, along with a network of drains, pathways, and other infrastructure. The monasteries are arranged in 2 parallel rows, facing each other across a wide central pathway, creating a formal campus layout that reflects the organized and institutional character of the university. Each monastery is built around a central courtyard, with individual cells for monks arranged on multiple floors around the courtyard, communal halls on the ground floor, and meditation rooms and libraries on the upper floors. The artifacts recovered from the excavations include thousands of inscribed seals, which bear the names and titles of monks, scholars, and administrators associated with the institution. These seals provide valuable evidence for the organization and the personnel of the university, revealing a hierarchical structure that included various ranks of scholars, administrators, and support staff. The seals also provide evidence for the international character of the institution, with some bearing names and titles that indicate the presence of scholars from China, Tibet, and other parts of Asia. The Chinese pilgrims' accounts provide crucial evidence about the methods of intellectual inquiry that were practiced at Nalanda. Xuanzang describes a system of formal debate that was central to the academic life of the institution. These debates were not casual discussions. They were highly structured intellectual contests, conducted according to strict rules of logic and rhetoric, in which scholars from different philosophical schools were required to defend their positions against rigorous critique. The debates could last for days, and they attracted large audiences of monks, students, and visiting scholars who came to witness the intellectual combat. The debating tradition at Nalanda was grounded in the sophisticated Indian logical tradition, which had developed independently of the Greek tradition, and which used different methods and different terminology. The Indian logicians had developed a formal system of inference that specified the conditions under which a conclusion could be validly drawn from premises, and they had elaborated a detailed taxonomy of logical fallacies that could be used to identify and refute invalid arguments. The study of logic was therefore not merely an academic exercise at Nalanda. It was a practical skill essential for participation in the debates that were the primary method of intellectual advancement, and the primary means by which philosophical ideas were tested, refined, and validated. The figure of Dharmakirti, who taught at Nalanda in the 7th century, deserves special attention for his contributions to the Indian logical tradition. Dharmakirti's Pramanavartika, or commentary on valid cognition, is one of the most important works in the history of Buddhist philosophy. In this text, Dharmakirti developed a comprehensive theory of knowledge that addressed the fundamental questions of epistemology. What counts as valid knowledge? How is knowledge acquired? And what are the criteria by which we can distinguish reliable knowledge from unreliable belief? His answers to these questions were sophisticated, subtle, and enormously influential, shaping the course of Buddhist philosophical thought in India, Tibet, and beyond. Dharmakirti's work is particularly significant because it represents the Indian Buddhist tradition's engagement with the most fundamental questions of philosophy in a manner that is both rigorous and original. His theory of perception, which distinguished between direct perceptual awareness and the conceptual constructions that the mind imposes on perceptual data, anticipated themes that would later be developed in Western philosophy by thinkers such as Immanuel Kant and the phenomenological tradition. His theory of inference, which specified the conditions under which one fact could be validly inferred from another, contributed to the development of a formal logic that, while different in its methods from Western formal logic, was no less rigorous in its standards and no less productive in its results. The study of Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara at Nalanda illustrates another dimension of the institution's intellectual life. The Bodhicharyavatara, composed probably in the 8th century, is a poetic and philosophical treatise on the path of the Bodhisattva, the Buddhist ideal of a being who seeks enlightenment not merely for personal liberation, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. The text combines philosophical argument with devotional poetry, ethical instruction with meditation technique, in a way that reflects the integrated character of the Nalanda curriculum. The Bodhicharyavatara was studied not merely as a philosophical text, but as a guide to spiritual practice, a manual for the cultivation of compassion, patience, generosity, and wisdom that were the essential virtues of the Buddhist path. The Nalanda tradition also made significant contributions to the study of Abhidharma, the systematic philosophical analysis of Buddhist doctrine that constitutes one of the three divisions of Buddhist canon. The Abhidharma texts, which originated in the early centuries of Buddhist history, provide a detailed analysis of the constituents of experience, the processes of perception and cognition, and the causal mechanisms that govern the arising and the cessation of suffering. The Abhidharma tradition at Nalanda was enriched by the contributions of scholars from multiple Buddhist schools, including the Sarvastivada, the Sautrantika, and the Yogacara schools, each of which offered its own analysis of the fundamental categories of Buddhist philosophy. The Vajrayana tradition, which became increasingly prominent at Nalanda during the Pala period, added a distinctive dimension to the intellectual life of the institution. The Vajrayana texts describe elaborate systems of meditation and ritual that use visualization, mantra recitation, and physical practices to transform the practitioner's experience of reality. These practices were grounded in a sophisticated philosophical framework that drew on the Madhyamaka and Yogacara traditions while adding new elements derived from Tantric Buddhism. The Vajrayana tradition produced a vast body of literature, including root tantras, commentaries, ritual manuals, and meditation guides, much of which was produced by scholars at Nalanda, and which was lost in the destruction of the library. The broader context of knowledge destruction in northern India during this period is essential for understanding the full scope of the loss. Nalanda was not the only major Buddhist monastery destroyed during the campaigns of Bhaktiya Khilji and his successors. The great monastery of Vikramasila, located approximately 200 miles east of Nalanda, was destroyed during the same period. Vikramasila had been founded in the late 8th century by the Pala king Dharmapala and had become one of the most important centers of Vajrayana Buddhist learning in India. Its destruction resulted in the loss of a library and a scholarly community that, while smaller than Nalanda's, was nonetheless of enormous intellectual significance. The monastery of Odantapuri, also located in Bihar, was similarly destroyed. Odantapuri was one of the oldest Buddhist universities in India, and it had served as a model for the construction of the first Tibetan monastery, Samye, in the 8th century. Its destruction severed another link in the chain of institutional and intellectual connections that had bound Indian Buddhism to the wider Buddhist world. The cumulative effect of these destructions was the complete elimination of the institutional infrastructure of Buddhist scholarship in India. Within a few decades of the fall of Nalanda, there was not a single functioning Buddhist university or major monastic library left in the Indian subcontinent. The tradition that had sustained Buddhist intellectual life in India for over 1500 years was not merely damaged, it was destroyed, uprooted, and erased from the landscape of Indian civilization. The effect was as if the entire system of European universities had been simultaneously destroyed in a single generation, with no possibility of rebuilding from the institutional knowledge and the scholarly networks that had sustained them. The loss was not merely quantitative but structural, affecting not only the content of knowledge but the institutional frameworks through which knowledge was produced, validated, transmitted, and continuously renewed through each successive generation of scholars and students. The impact of the Nalanda destruction on the development of Buddhist thought in India and across Asia cannot be overstated. Before the destruction, India had been the intellectual center of the Buddhist world, the source from which new ideas, new texts, and new teachers flowed outward to the Buddhist communities of Tibet, China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. The destruction of Nalanda and the other great Indian monasteries cut off this source, forcing the Buddhist communities of Asia to develop independently without the continuing input from the Indian heartland that had sustained and stimulated their intellectual traditions for centuries. The effect was different in different regions. In Tibet, which had been the most recent recipient of the Indian Buddhist intellectual tradition, and which had the most active program of translation from Sanskrit, in the period immediately before the destruction, the impact was mitigated by the large body of translated material that had already been accumulated. The Tibetan tradition was able to continue developing on the basis of the Indian materials it had received, and it produced its own original philosophical and religious literature that built on and extended the Indian foundations. But the Tibetan tradition was nevertheless shaped by the fact that its Indian sources were cut off at a particular moment in history, and the specific character of Tibetan Buddhist thought reflects the particular selection of Indian texts that happened to have been translated before that cutoff. In China, the impact was less dramatic because the Chinese Buddhist tradition had been receiving translations of Indian texts for nearly 1,000 years before the destruction of Nalanda, and the Chinese canon already contained a vast body of translated literature. The Chinese tradition had also developed its own distinctive schools of Buddhist thought, including Chan, Pure Land, and Tiantai, which were less dependent on continuing input from India than the Tibetan tradition. Nevertheless, the loss of the Indian source meant that the Chinese tradition, like the Tibetan tradition, was forced to develop in relative isolation from the Indian philosophical developments that had been one of the most important stimuli to its intellectual growth. In Southeast Asia, the impact was perhaps the most devastating. The Buddhist communities of mainland Southeast Asia, particularly in Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, had been closely connected to the Indian Buddhist tradition through trade routes and pilgrimage paths that had facilitated the exchange of texts, teachers, and ideas for centuries. The destruction of the Indian monasteries severed these connections, and the Southeast Asian Buddhist communities were forced to develop independently without the continuing input from India that had nourished their traditions. The result was a gradual shift in the character of Southeast Asian Buddhism away from the scholastic and philosophical orientation that had characterized the Indian tradition and toward a more devotional and practice-oriented form of Buddhism that placed less emphasis on the study of philosophical texts and more emphasis on meditation, merit-making, and monastic discipline. The broader intellectual impact on the Indian subcontinent itself was profound. The destruction of the Buddhist monasteries removed from Indian intellectual life one of its most productive and most creative traditions of philosophical thought. The Buddhist contribution to Indian philosophy, which had been one of the driving forces of Indian intellectual life for over 1,500 years, effectively ceased. The Hindu philosophical traditions continued to develop, but they lost one of their most important interlocutors, the Buddhist philosophers, whose challenges and criticisms had stimulated some of the most original and most productive philosophical work in the Hindu tradition. The loss of the Buddhist philosophical tradition was therefore a loss not only for Buddhism but for Indian intellectual life as a whole, a diminishment of the diversity and the vitality of the intellectual ecosystem that had sustained some of the most remarkable philosophical achievements in human history. The question of whether the destruction of Nalanda was inevitable, or whether it could have been prevented, is a question that historians have debated. Some argue that the Buddhist monasteries were already in decline before the military conquest, weakened by the loss of royal patronage, the competition from resurgent Hindu traditions, and the internal intellectual exhaustion of a tradition that had been producing philosophical literature for over 1,500 years. Others argue that the monasteries, while facing challenges, were still vibrant intellectual centers that might have continued to flourish if they had been protected from military attack. The historical evidence supports both interpretations to some degree, and the truth probably lies somewhere in between. The monasteries were facing challenges, but the challenges were not fatal. What was fatal was the military conquest, the burning and the killing that destroyed in weeks what had taken centuries to build. The medical knowledge that was lost in the destruction of Nalanda represents a particularly poignant dimension of the overall loss. The Ayurvedic medical tradition that was studied at Nalanda had been developing for over 2,000 years and had accumulated a vast body of empirical knowledge about the diagnosis and the treatment of disease. The medical texts at Nalanda included descriptions of surgical techniques, pharmacological preparations, and diagnostic methods that reflected centuries of clinical observation and therapeutic experimentation. Some of this knowledge survived in the texts that had been translated into Tibetan before the destruction, and it became the foundation of the Tibetan medical tradition. But much of it was lost, and the specific treatments, the specific remedies, and the specific diagnostic techniques that were described in the untranslated medical texts are gone forever. The astronomical and mathematical knowledge at Nalanda was similarly significant. The Indian mathematical tradition had produced innovations of fundamental importance, including the concept of zero, the decimal place value number system, and significant advances in algebra, trigonometry, and computational methods. The mathematical texts at Nalanda built on these foundations and extended them in ways that we can only partially reconstruct from the fragments that survive. The loss of the full mathematical library at Nalanda means that we cannot know the full extent of Indian mathematical achievement in the period between the 6th and the 12th centuries, a period that may have produced innovations that were lost in the destruction, and that are therefore absent from the historical record. The grammatical tradition at Nalanda also represents a significant loss. The study of Sanskrit grammar, grounded in the monumental work of Panini, was one of the core disciplines of the Nalanda curriculum. The grammatical texts produced at Nalanda included not only commentaries on Panini's foundational work, but also original contributions to the theory of language, the analysis of meaning, and the relationship between language and thought. Some of these works survived in translation or in copies that had been distributed before the destruction, but many others were lost. The personal stories of the scholars who were affected by the destruction, while largely unknown to us, can be partially reconstructed from the biographical traditions preserved in Tibetan and other sources. The accounts describe monks fleeing the burning monasteries with whatever manuscripts they could carry, travelling on foot through dangerous territory to reach the safety of Nepal, Tibet, or other regions beyond the reach of the invading armies. Some of these refugee scholars succeeded in reaching their destinations and in establishing new centres of learning in exile that preserved elements of the Nalanda tradition. Others were killed on the road, captured by bandits, or died of exposure and starvation. The manuscripts they carried, the precious remnants of the great library, were sometimes lost during the journey, damaged by weather, or abandoned when the burden became too great. The figure of the Tibetan translator Rwalotsawa Dorjadrak illustrates the complexity of the transmission process. Rwalotsawa travelled to India multiple times in the 11th and 12th centuries, studying at Nalanda and other Indian monasteries and translating texts into Tibetan. His translations, which include important works on the Vajrayana tradition, represent one of the final transmissions of Indian Buddhist learning to Tibet, before the destruction of the Indian monasteries. The texts that Rwalotsawa translated survived the destruction because they had been carried to Tibet before the fire, but the texts that he did not translate, the texts that he intended to return for on a future visit, were consumed along with the rest of the library. The story of Shakya Sri Bhadra is perhaps the most poignant illustration of the final days of Indian Buddhist scholarship. Shakya Sri Bhadra was one of the last great scholars of the Nalanda tradition, a teacher of remarkable learning and charisma who continued to teach and to translate texts even as the political situation in northern India deteriorated. In the early 13th century, after the destruction of the major monasteries, Shakya Sri Bhadra travelled to Tibet, where he spent the remaining years of his life teaching and translating. He is said to have brought with him a small collection of manuscripts, the final remnants of the great libraries of Bihar. These manuscripts, translated by Shakya Sri Bhadra and his Tibetan students, represent the last wave of the Indian Buddhist textual tradition to reach Tibet, the final transmission from a tradition that had been flowing for centuries, and that was now irrevocably at an end. The question of whether the fire at Nalanda truly burned for 6 months is a matter of ongoing debate among historians. Some scholars accept the traditional claim, arguing that the enormous volume of palm leaf manuscripts in the multi-story library buildings would have provided sufficient fuel for a fire of that duration. Others are skeptical, suggesting that the claim may be an exaggeration intended to emphasize the scale of the destruction. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Even if the fire did not burn continuously for 6 full months, the process of destruction, which included not only burning but also looting, demolition, and abandonment, certainly extended over a prolonged period. The buildings of the Dharmaganja would not have been consumed instantly. The fire would have worked its way through the enormous and densely packed collection of manuscripts gradually, relentlessly, destroying floor after floor, room after room, text after text, over a period of weeks or months. The patterns of destruction that characterized the military campaigns in Bihar were not unique to the attack on Nalanda. The invading armies systematically targeted the large Buddhist monasteries of the region, which they identified as fortified positions, and which they attacked with the full force of their military capability. The pattern was consistent. The monasteries were surrounded, the monks were killed or driven out, the buildings were looted and then set on fire, and the contents, including the libraries, were destroyed. The consistency of this pattern suggests that the destruction of the monasteries was not merely an incidental consequence of military operations, but a deliberate strategy, whether motivated by hostility toward the religious tradition they represented, or by the practical desire to eliminate potential centers of resistance. The effect on the local population was devastating, far-reaching, and deeply disruptive, extending well beyond the immediate violence of the military campaign itself, and persisting long after the armies had moved on. The Buddhist monasteries had been major employers and major economic institutions in the communities where they were located. The monks who inhabited them consumed food, clothing, and other goods produced by local farmers and artisans. The visitors who came to study and to worship at the monasteries brought trade and economic activity to the surrounding area. The destruction of the monasteries therefore caused not only cultural and intellectual losses, but also economic disruption that affected the livelihoods of thousands of people who had been dependent on the monastic institutions for their economic well-being. The disappearance of Buddhism as an organized religion in India, following the destruction of the monasteries, is one of the most significant religious transformations in the history of South Asia. Before the destruction, Buddhism had been a major religious tradition in India for over 1,500 years, practiced by millions of people and supported by a vast institutional infrastructure of monasteries, temples, and universities. After the destruction, Buddhism virtually disappeared from the Indian subcontinent, surviving only in scattered pockets in Nepal, the Himalayan regions, and the far south of the subcontinent. The speed and the completeness of this disappearance are extraordinary, and they testify to the extent to which Indian Buddhism had become dependent on the monastic institutions that were destroyed. The oral tradition that accompanied the written texts at Nalanda represented a layer of knowledge that was particularly vulnerable to destruction. In the Indian Buddhist tradition, the relationship between written and oral knowledge was complex and intimate. Written texts were regarded as aids to memory and as supplements to the oral teachings that were transmitted directly from teacher to student. The senior scholars at Nalanda possessed vast stores of oral knowledge, including interpretive commentaries, debating strategies, meditation instructions, and anecdotal illustrations that supplemented and contextualized the written texts they taught. This oral knowledge was not recorded in any manuscript. It existed only in the minds of the teachers who possessed it, and in the minds of the students who received it. When the teachers were killed and the students scattered, this oral knowledge was lost, and its loss was, in many ways, even more devastating than the loss of the manuscripts, because the manuscripts could at least be partially recovered through translation and archaeological discovery, while the oral knowledge was gone without a trace. The destruction of the administrative infrastructure of the university is another dimension of the loss that is often overlooked. The university had developed, over 7 centuries of continuous operation, a sophisticated system of governance that included mechanisms for the selection of teachers, the admission of students, the allocation of resources, the management of the library, and the conduct of public debates. This system of governance represented institutional knowledge of great value, knowledge that had been accumulated through centuries of experience and that enabled the university to function efficiently as both a scholarly institution and a monastic community. The destruction of this institutional knowledge, which was embodied in the practices and the traditions of the administrative staff rather than in any written document, was a loss that affected not only Nalanda itself, but also the other institutions across Asia that had modelled their governance structures on the Nalanda example. The question of what survived the burning of Nalanda is one of the most important and most complex questions in the study of Buddhist intellectual history. The answer, as we shall see, is both encouraging and devastating. Encouraging because a significant body of Indian Buddhist literature did survive the destruction, preserved in translations that had been made into Chinese, Tibetan, and other Asian languages before the library burned. Devastating because the surviving translations represent only a fraction of the original corpus, and because the loss of the Sanskrit originals means that we can never be certain that the translations accurately represent the full content and the full nuance of the works they translate. Let us begin with the Tibetan transmission, which is the most important channel through which Indian Buddhist texts survived the destruction of Nalanda. Tibet had been in close contact with Indian Buddhism since the 7th century, when the Tibetan king Songtsen Gampo sent scholars to India to learn Sanskrit and to bring back Buddhist texts for translation. This project of translation continued for centuries, and by the time of Nalanda's destruction, a vast body of Indian Buddhist literature had been translated into Tibetan and incorporated into the Tibetan Buddhist canon. The Tibetan canon, as it exists today, consists of 2 major collections. The Kangya, which contains translations of the words of the Buddha, including sutras, tantras, and Vinaya texts, and the Tengyur, which contains translations of commentaries and independent treatises by Indian Buddhist scholars. Together, these 2 collections comprise over 4,000 individual works, representing the largest surviving body of translated Indian Buddhist literature in any language. Many of the works in the Tengyur are translations of texts that were produced by scholars associated with Nalanda and the other great Indian monasteries, and they provide our primary evidence for the intellectual output of those institutions. The Tibetan translations are invaluable, but they have significant limitations as substitutes for the lost Sanskrit originals. Translation is always an act of interpretation, and the Tibetan translators, however skilled and however conscientious, inevitably made choices about how to render Sanskrit terms, concepts, and syntactic structures in Tibetan that reflected their own understanding and their own cultural context. The result is that the Tibetan translations, while generally faithful to the content of the originals, do not always capture the full range of meaning, the stylistic features, and the philosophical nuances of the Sanskrit texts they translate. Scholars who work with the Tibetan translations are constantly aware that they are working with a secondary source, a reflection of the original rather than the original itself, and that the reflection, however clear, inevitably distorts certain features of the object it reflects. The Chinese transmission represents another major channel through which Indian Buddhist texts survived. The translation of Buddhist texts from Sanskrit and other Indian languages into Chinese began in the 2nd century of the Common Era and continued for over 1,000 years, producing a vast body of translated literature that is preserved in the Chinese Buddhist canon, the Dazangjing. The Chinese canon is one of the largest bodies of religious literature in the world, comprising thousands of individual texts in hundreds of volumes. It includes translations of many works that were studied at Nalanda, and it provides an independent witness to the Indian Buddhist textual tradition that can be compared with the Tibetan translations to reconstruct the content of lost Sanskrit originals. Xuanzang himself was one of the greatest translators in the history of the Chinese Buddhist tradition. After returning to China from his years of study at Nalanda, he spent the remaining decades of his life translating the Sanskrit manuscripts he had brought back with him, producing Chinese versions of some of the most important works of Indian Buddhist philosophy. His translations are among the most accurate and most influential in the Chinese Buddhist canon, and they preserve texts that might otherwise have been entirely lost. The manuscripts that Xuanzang brought back to China, which reportedly numbered over 600, represented only a tiny fraction of the Nalanda library's holdings, but they included some of the most important works of the Yogacara philosophical tradition, and their preservation in Chinese translation has been crucial for the study of Indian Buddhist thought. Let that sink in. A single pilgrim traveling on foot and by horse across thousands of miles of desert, mountain and jungle carried 600 manuscripts out of a library that contained millions. Those 600 manuscripts, translated into Chinese over the course of decades of painstaking work, became a foundation of East Asian Buddhist philosophy. They represent one of the most important acts of intellectual preservation in human history, and yet they represent less than 0.1% of the library's total holdings. The disproportion between what was saved and what was lost is staggering. The Japanese transmission provides yet another channel of survival. Japanese Buddhism received its textual tradition primarily through China, and the Japanese Buddhist canon includes translations and copies of many works that originated in India and were studied at Nalanda. The Japanese tradition also preserved important commentarial works by Chinese and Korean scholars who had studied the Indian Buddhist texts and who added their own interpretations and analyses. These East Asian commentarial traditions, while not direct translations of Indian originals, provide additional evidence for the content and the interpretation of works that were once held in the Nalanda library. The numbers are striking when we consider the scale of the surviving Buddhist literary tradition in comparison with the estimated size of the Nalanda collection. The Tibetan canon contains approximately 4,300 individual works. The Chinese canon contains approximately 2,500 translated Indian Buddhist texts, along with thousands of additional works by Chinese Buddhist authors. Even if we add the texts preserved in Pali, the canonical language of Theravada Buddhism, and the scattered Sanskrit manuscripts that have been recovered from various sources, the total number of surviving Indian Buddhist texts is a small fraction of the estimated 9 million manuscripts that were held in the Nalanda library. But the comparison is not straightforward, because the 9 million figure, if it is accurate, certainly includes multiple copies of the same texts, along with commentaries, sub-commentaries, and other derivative works that may have added bulk to the collection without adding proportionally to its intellectual content. A library that holds 9 million manuscripts does not necessarily contain 9 million different texts. It may contain a much smaller number of unique texts, each represented by multiple copies and surrounded by layers of commentarial literature. The actual number of unique texts in the Nalanda collection is impossible to determine, but it was certainly much smaller than 9 million. Even so, the loss is immense. Many of the works that were produced by Nalanda scholars are known to us only by their titles, which appear in the colophons and bibliographies of surviving texts, but which do not correspond to any known surviving work. These ghost texts, works whose existence is attested, but whose content is unknown, represent the most tantalizing and most frustrating category of loss. We know that they existed. We know who wrote them. We sometimes know what subjects they addressed. But we cannot read them, because every copy was destroyed in the fires of 1193 and the years that followed. The archaeological exploration of the Nalanda site has provided additional evidence for the scale and the nature of the institution, but it has not recovered any significant body of manuscripts. The ruins of Nalanda were identified in the 19th century by the archaeologist Alexander Cunningham, who recognized the site from the descriptions provided by Xuanzang and other Chinese pilgrims. Systematic excavation began in the early 20th century and has continued intermittently to the present day. The excavations have revealed the foundations of the monasteries, temples, and other buildings that constituted the university complex, along with a wealth of sculptures, inscriptions, seals, and other artifacts that have illuminated the history and the daily life of the institution. But the one thing that the excavations have not found, and that they are unlikely ever to find, is the manuscripts themselves. Palm leaf manuscripts do not survive well in the archaeological record, particularly in the humid climate of Bihar. Any manuscripts that escaped the fire would have been rapidly destroyed by moisture, insects, and microbial decomposition. The archaeological record preserves the buildings of Nalanda, but not the knowledge that those buildings contained. The ruins stand as a physical reminder of the institution's former greatness, but they are silent on the question of what was written on the palm leaves that filled the shelves of the Dharma Ganja. The search for surviving Nalanda texts has taken scholars to libraries and monasteries across Asia. Tibetan monasteries, particularly those in remote areas of Tibet, Nepal, and northern India, have been a particularly rich source of manuscripts that preserve Indian Buddhist texts in Tibetan translation. The great collections at the Potala Palace in Lhasa, at the Sakya Monastery in southwestern Tibet, and at various Nyingma and Kagyu monasteries in eastern Tibet and Bhutan, contain thousands of manuscripts that have never been fully catalogued or studied. Some of these manuscripts may preserve translations of texts that were lost in the destruction of Nalanda, translations that were made by Indian scholars who visited Tibet before the library burned. The discovery of Sanskrit manuscripts in unexpected locations has occasionally produced dramatic results. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, European explorers and scholars discovered collections of Sanskrit Buddhist manuscripts in the oasis cities of the Silk Road, in Central Asia, where the dry desert climate had preserved documents that would have been destroyed in the humid conditions of the Indian subcontinent. The manuscripts found at sites like Dunhuang, Turfan, Khotan, and Gilgit include fragments of works that were once part of the Indian Buddhist literary tradition, and that may have been copies of texts held at Nalanda and other Indian monastic libraries. The Gilgit manuscripts, discovered in the 1930s in the northern regions of modern Pakistan, include some of the oldest surviving Sanskrit Buddhist manuscripts in the world, dating to the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. These manuscripts preserve texts that are contemporary with the early period of Nalanda's existence, and that provide evidence for the Buddhist literary tradition as it existed before the great expansion of the Nalanda library. The discovery of these manuscripts demonstrated that Sanskrit Buddhist texts could survive in regions outside India, preserved by the favourable climatic conditions that the Indian subcontinent itself could not provide. More recently, the Nepal German Manuscript Preservation Project and similar initiatives have documented and digitized thousands of Sanskrit manuscripts preserved in private and monastic collections in Nepal. Nepal, which shares a border with Bihar, and which has had close cultural ties with the Indian Buddhist tradition for centuries, has proven to be one of the most important repositories of surviving Sanskrit Buddhist manuscripts. Some of these manuscripts may be copies of texts that were brought out of India during or after the destruction of the great monasteries, preserving knowledge that would otherwise have been lost entirely. The ongoing digitization of Buddhist manuscripts from collections around the world has begun to create a virtual library that partially compensates for the physical destruction of the Nalanda collection. Projects such as the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, formerly known as the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center, have made hundreds of thousands of pages of Buddhist text available online, enabling scholars to search for and compare texts across multiple collections and multiple languages. These digital resources have already led to the identification of previously unknown texts and to the correction of errors in existing editions, and they promise to continue producing important discoveries as more material is digitized and made available. But digitization, like every other tool of recovery, has its limitations. It can make existing manuscripts more accessible, but it cannot recreate manuscripts that no longer exist. It can facilitate the study of what has survived, but it cannot restore what has been lost. The void at the center of the story, the millions of manuscripts that were consumed by the fire of 1193, remains unfilled and unfipple. Every new discovery, every newly digitized manuscript, every newly identified text adds a piece to the puzzle. But the puzzle itself is so vast, and so many of its pieces are missing, that the complete picture can never be reconstructed. The challenge of reconstruction is compounded by the nature of the surviving evidence. The texts that survive in Tibetan and Chinese translation were translated by individuals with their own intellectual interests and their own interpretive frameworks. A text that was considered important by a 7th century Chinese translator may not have been the text that a 12th century Tibetan translator would have chosen, and vice versa. The result is that the surviving corpus is not a coherent sample of the original collection, but a patchwork of selections made by different translators at different times for different reasons. Reconstructing the original collection from this patchwork is like trying to reconstruct a mosaic from a handful of tiles that were saved by different people who each chose the tiles that happened to appeal to them personally. The problem is further complicated by the fact that many of the texts that survive in translation have never been published in modern critical editions. The Tibetan and Chinese canons are vast, and the scholarly resources available for their study are limited. Many texts in these canons exist only in manuscript form or in old woodblock prints that are difficult to read and that may contain errors introduced by generations of copyists. The production of reliable critical editions of these texts, based on the comparison of multiple manuscript witnesses and informed by a thorough understanding of the Sanskrit originals where they survive, is a task that will occupy generations of scholars, and that is still in its early stages. The surviving Sanskrit manuscripts, those rare originals that escaped the destruction, are among the most precious objects in the heritage of Asian civilization. Each one represents a direct link to the intellectual world of medieval India, a physical artifact that was produced in the scriptoria of the great monasteries, and that has survived, through a chain of fortunate circumstances, to the present day. These manuscripts are often fragmentary, damaged by time and the elements, and difficult to read, but they are invaluable because they provide the only direct evidence for the original wording, the original syntax, and the original philosophical nuances of the Indian Buddhist texts. Where a Sanskrit original survives alongside Tibetan and Chinese translations of the same text, scholars can compare the three versions to assess the accuracy of the translations and to reconstruct features of the original that the translations may have obscured. This method of trilingual comparison has produced important insights into the translation techniques of the Tibetan and Chinese translators, and has revealed cases where the translations diverge significantly from the Sanskrit original, indicating either errors in the translation process or deliberate interpretive choices by the translators that shaped the meaning of the text in ways that its original authors did not intend. The question of how much of the Nalanda library's content was truly unique, existing only in the Sanskrit originals that were destroyed, and how much was preserved in copies that had been distributed to other locations, is one of the most important questions in the study of Buddhist intellectual history. The answer varies enormously depending on the type of text and the period of its composition. The earlier texts, those composed in the first millennium of the Common Era, had the longest period of time in which to be copied and distributed, and they are therefore more likely to survive in translation. The later texts, particularly those composed in the final centuries before the destruction, had less time for distribution, and are therefore more likely to have been lost entirely. The Tantric texts present a particular challenge in this regard. Many of the Tantric texts composed at Nalanda during the Pala period were considered esoteric, meaning that they were not intended for general distribution, but were transmitted only to qualified initiates who had received the appropriate empowerments and instructions. This restricted distribution means that many Tantric texts may have existed in only a small number of copies, all of which may have been held at Nalanda or at the other Indian monasteries that were destroyed during the same period. The loss of these esoteric texts may be particularly complete because their restricted distribution meant that fewer copies existed and fewer translations had been made before the destruction. The medical texts that were held at Nalanda represent another category of particularly significant loss. The Indian medical tradition, as we have noted, was comprehensive and sophisticated, encompassing diagnosis, treatment, pharmacology, surgery, and preventive medicine. The medical texts at Nalanda included not only the classic Ayurvedic treatises, but also newer works that incorporated centuries of additional clinical observation and therapeutic innovation. Some of these medical texts were translated into Tibetan and became the foundation of the Tibetan medical tradition, but many others were not translated and are permanently lost. The specific treatments, the specific diagnostic techniques, and the specific pharmacological knowledge that were contained in the untranslated medical texts are gone, and they cannot be reconstructed from any surviving source. The astronomical and mathematical texts at Nalanda represent yet another dimension of the loss. The Indian mathematical tradition, which had produced such fundamental innovations as the concept of zero, the decimal place value number system, and significant advances in algebra, trigonometry, and computational techniques, was represented at Nalanda by a body of literature that included both the classic texts of Indian mathematics and newer works that built on and extended those classic foundations. Some of these texts survived in translation or in copies that had been made before the destruction, but many others were lost, and the specific mathematical insights and the specific computational techniques they contained are gone. The role of Atisha in the transmission of Nalanda learning to Tibet deserves particular attention. Atisha Dipankara Srijnana, born in Bengal in approximately 982 of the Common Era, was one of the most important scholars in the later history of Nalanda. He studied at the university and eventually became one of its most distinguished teachers, mastering the full range of Buddhist philosophy, logic, and meditation practice. In 1042, at the invitation of the king of Western Tibet, Atisha travelled to Tibet, where he spent the remaining years of his life teaching, translating texts, and establishing a reformed Buddhist tradition that would become the foundation of the Kadampa school, which later gave rise to the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism, the school of the Dalai Lamas. Atisha's journey to Tibet was, in retrospect, one of the most consequential acts of intellectual preservation in the history of Asian civilization. By carrying his knowledge and his manuscripts to Tibet, Atisha ensured that a significant portion of the Nalanda intellectual tradition would survive the destruction that was to come a century and a half later. The texts that he translated, the oral teachings that he transmitted, and the institutional models that he established in Tibet became the foundation of a Tibetan Buddhist scholarly tradition that has preserved and continued the intellectual legacy of Nalanda to the present day. The survival of specific texts illustrates both the successes and the failures of the transmission process. The works of Nagarjuna, the founder of the Madhyamaka school, survive in substantial quantity in both Tibetan and Chinese translation. His most important work, the Mulamadhyama Kakarika, or Fundamental Verses on the Middle Way, is one of the most studied and most commented upon texts in the entire Buddhist philosophical tradition. The survival of this text, in multiple translations and in a rich tradition of commentary, has ensured that Nagarjuna's philosophical insights remain available to scholars and practitioners today, more than 18 centuries after they were first composed. But for every text that survived, many did not. The bibliographies and colophons of surviving texts contain references to works that do not correspond to any known surviving text. These references are the traces of lost works, markers of intellectual activity that once existed, but that was consumed by the fires of 1193. The logician Dignaga, who preceded Dharmakirti, and who is often regarded as the founder of the Buddhist logical tradition, is known to have composed a number of works that survive only in fragments or in partial translations. The full scope of his intellectual contribution may never be known, because the complete versions of his works that were once preserved at Nalanda are gone. The case of Vasubandhu, the great Yogacara philosopher, illustrates the complexity of the survival question. Vasubandhu's major works, including the Abhidharmakoshabhasya and the Vimshatika and Trimshatika, survive in both Sanskrit and Tibetan translation, making them among the best preserved works from the Nalanda tradition. But Vasubandhu is known to have composed many other works, commentaries, shorter treatises, and responses to critics that do not survive in any form. The Vasubandhu we know today is a partial Vasubandhu, a scholar whose most famous works have been preserved but whose full intellectual output remains unknown. The Pali tradition, which preserves the canonical literature of Theravada Buddhism in the Pali language, represents a separate channel of Buddhist textual survival that is largely independent of the Nalanda tradition. The Pali canon, which was compiled in Sri Lanka and which has been transmitted primarily through the Theravada Buddhist communities of Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, preserves texts from the earliest period of Buddhist history that predate the founding of Nalanda. The Pali tradition is therefore not a direct product of the Nalanda library, and its survival was not affected by the destruction of that library. However, the Pali tradition does preserve texts that overlap with some of the material that was held at Nalanda, and it provides an independent witness to the early Buddhist literary tradition that can be used to supplement and to check the evidence provided by the Tibetan and Chinese translations. The discovery of ancient Buddhist manuscripts in unexpected locations continues to produce occasional surprises. In the 1990s, a collection of birch bark manuscripts dating to the 1st century of the Common Era was discovered in Afghanistan. These Gandharan Buddhist manuscripts, written in the Gandhari language, are among the oldest surviving Buddhist texts in the world. While they predate the founding of Nalanda by centuries, they provide evidence for the early Buddhist textual tradition from which the Nalanda collection ultimately derived. Their discovery demonstrates that the Buddhist literary tradition is even older and more geographically widespread than previously documented, and that important discoveries may still lie hidden in the earth, waiting to be found. The work of modern scholars in reconstructing the intellectual world of Nalanda draws on a wide range of sources and methods. Textual scholars compare Tibetan and Chinese translations of the same Indian original to reconstruct the content and the wording of the lost Sanskrit text. Philosophical scholars analyze the arguments and the concepts of surviving Nalanda works to understand the intellectual debates that animated the community. Art historians study the sculptures and the paintings that decorated the Nalanda campus to understand the religious and the aesthetic values of the institution. Archaeologists excavate the physical remains of the site to understand the material conditions in which the intellectual life of the university was conducted. Each of these disciplines contributes a piece to the puzzle, and together they provide a picture of Nalanda that, while incomplete, is far richer and far more detailed than it was a century ago. The mathematical dimensions of the loss remain staggering. If we accept even a fraction of the traditional estimate of 9 million manuscripts, the quantity of lost text exceeds anything in the ancient Western world. The complete works of Aristotle, which were themselves partially lost, and which required centuries of transmission through Arabic and Latin translation to reach modern Europe, comprise approximately 1 million words. The Library of Alexandria, at its peak, may have contained the equivalent of several 100 million words of text. The Nalanda Library, at a conservative estimate of 1 million manuscripts averaging several thousand words each, would have contained several billion words of text, a corpus that dwarfs anything in the pre-modern world. The comparison between what survived and what was lost is instructive in another way. The texts that survived, those that had been translated into Tibetan, Chinese, or other languages before the destruction, are not a random sample of the total collection. They are a biased sample, shaped by the particular interests and the particular priorities of the translators who selected them. The Tibetan translators, for example, were particularly interested in Madhyamaka and Yogacara philosophy, in tantric texts, and in works on logic and epistemology. They were less interested in medical texts, astronomical works, and texts on the arts and the sciences that did not have a direct bearing on Buddhist philosophical and religious practice. The result is that the surviving Tibetan translations over-represent certain categories of text and underrepresent others, creating a distorted picture of the original collection. The Chinese translations exhibit a different set of biases. The Chinese translators were particularly interested in the sutras, the canonical texts attributed to the Buddha, and in the major philosophical works of the Madhyamaka and Yogacara traditions. They were less interested in the commentarial literature, the debate manuals, the liturgical texts, and the administrative documents that constituted a significant portion of the Nalanda collection. The result is that the surviving Chinese translations, like the Tibetan translations, provide a partial and biased picture of the original corpus. The implications of these biases are significant. The picture of the Indian Buddhist intellectual tradition that we construct from the surviving translations is not a picture of the tradition as it actually was. It is a picture of the tradition as it was seen through the particular lenses of the Tibetan and Chinese translators who selected and translated the texts that survive. The full tradition, the tradition as it existed at Nalanda in all its breadth and all its diversity, is beyond our reach, hidden behind the filters of translation bias and the curtain of destruction that fell in 1193. Modern computational approaches to the study of Buddhist texts have begun to reveal patterns and connections that were previously invisible. The development of digital databases of Tibetan and Chinese Buddhist texts, combined with computational tools for textual analysis, has enabled scholars to identify cross-references, quotations, and intertextual connections that link surviving texts to lost works. By tracing these connections, scholars can sometimes reconstruct the outlines of lost texts, identifying their major arguments, their key terms, and their relationships to other works in the tradition. This method of reconstruction is necessarily approximate and incomplete, but it provides valuable information about works that would otherwise be entirely unknown. The physical recovery of Sanskrit Buddhist manuscripts continues to produce occasional discoveries of great importance. The collection of Sanskrit Buddhist manuscripts preserved in the monasteries of Nepal remains partially unexplored, and new texts continue to be identified among the Nepalese manuscripts. In 2007, a collection of Sanskrit manuscripts was discovered in Tibet that included texts that had been thought to be entirely lost. These discoveries demonstrate that the process of recovery is ongoing, and that important new finds are still possible, even centuries after the destruction of the Indian monasteries. The role of the Silk Road in the preservation and the transmission of Buddhist texts deserves further consideration. The trade routes that connected India to Central Asia, China, and beyond served not only as channels for the exchange of goods, but also as channels for the exchange of ideas and texts. Buddhist missionaries and scholars traveled along these routes for centuries, carrying manuscripts and oral teachings from the Indian heartland to the Buddhist communities of Central and East Asia. The manuscripts that have been recovered from the Silk Road oasis cities, particularly from Dunhuang in western China, include Buddhist texts in Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, Uyghur, and other languages that provide evidence for the wide geographical distribution of the Buddhist literary tradition. The Dunhuang Cave Library, discovered in 1900 by the Taoist priest Wang Yuanlu, is one of the most important finds in the history of Buddhist manuscript studies. The cave contained approximately 40,000 manuscripts and printed documents, dating from the 5th to the 11th centuries, that had been sealed in the cave for nearly 1,000 years. The collection includes Buddhist sutras, commentaries, ritual texts, and administrative documents in multiple languages, providing an extraordinary snapshot of the Buddhist literary tradition as it existed in Central Asia in the centuries before the destruction of the Indian monasteries. While the Dunhuang collection is not a direct product of the Nalanda library, it preserves texts that were part of the same broader Buddhist literary tradition, and it provides evidence for the distribution and the survival of texts that may have originated in India. The Japanese monk Kukai, who travelled to China in the early 9th century and who returned to Japan with a large collection of Buddhist texts and ritual objects, represents another important channel of transmission. Kukai's collection, which formed the basis of the Shingon school of Japanese Buddhism, included tantric texts and ritual manuals that had originated in India and that had been transmitted to China through the networks of Buddhist scholarly exchange. The preservation of these texts in Japan provides yet another witness to the Indian Buddhist literary tradition, a witness that is independent of both the Tibetan and the Chinese canonical collections. The ongoing work of international Buddhist scholarship has produced a growing body of critical editions, translations, and studies that make the surviving Indian Buddhist texts available to scholars and students around the world. The International Association of Buddhist Studies, founded in 1976, provides a forum for scholars from multiple disciplines and multiple countries to share their research and to coordinate their efforts. The publication of critical editions of Tibetan and Chinese Buddhist texts, the development of concordances and dictionaries for the Buddhist technical vocabulary, and the training of new generations of scholars in the languages and the methods of Buddhist textual study are all essential components of the ongoing effort to recover and to preserve the intellectual legacy of Nalanda. The category of texts known as Shastra, or independent philosophical treatises, represents one of the most significant losses from the Nalanda collection. The Shastra literature includes the original philosophical works produced by the scholars of Nalanda and other Indian Buddhist institutions, works that developed new arguments, addressed new problems, and extended the boundaries of Buddhist philosophical thought. These were not commentaries on existing texts or summaries of established doctrines. They were original contributions to philosophical knowledge, works that reflected the creative energy and the intellectual ambition of the Nalanda scholarly community. Many of these works survive in Tibetan or Chinese translation, but many others do not, and the specific arguments, the specific insights, and the specific philosophical innovations they contain are gone. The liturgical and ritual texts from Nalanda constitute another significant category of loss. The Buddhist monastic community at Nalanda maintained an elaborate program of daily worship, seasonal festivals, and special ceremonies that was supported by a body of ritual literature describing the procedures, the prayers, the offerings, and the symbolic actions that constituted each ritual. These liturgical texts were essential for the maintenance of the religious life of the institution, and they provide valuable evidence for the lived experience of Buddhist monasticism in medieval India. Some liturgical texts survived in translation, particularly in the Tibetan tradition, where they were adapted for use in Tibetan monastic practice. But many others were lost, and the specific rituals and the specific practices they described are no longer recoverable. The educational texts, including textbooks, debate manuals, and examination guides, represent a particularly interesting category of loss. These texts, which were used in the day-to-day work of teaching and learning at Nalanda, provide the most direct evidence for the pedagogical methods and the intellectual standards of the institution. A debate manual, for example, might describe the formal rules governing a philosophical debate, the types of arguments that were considered valid, the types of fallacies that were to be avoided, and the criteria by which the winner of a debate was determined. An examination guide might list the topics that were covered in the entrance examination or in the examinations that marked the progression of a student through the curriculum. These texts are largely lost, and our understanding of the educational methods at Nalanda is therefore based primarily on the indirect evidence provided by the accounts of the Chinese pilgrims and the occasional references in surviving philosophical works. The administrative records of the university, including correspondence, financial accounts, personnel records, and legal documents, represent yet another category of loss. These records, which would have been kept on palm leaves like the scholarly manuscripts, were presumably stored in the library or in separate administrative offices within the university complex. They would have provided invaluable evidence for the economic, social, and institutional history of the university, illuminating questions about the sources and the uses of the institution's wealth, the organization of its administrative staff, the relations between the university and its royal patrons, and the mechanisms by which the university maintained its operations over 7 centuries. These records were almost certainly destroyed in the fire, and the administrative history of Nalanda must therefore be reconstructed from the fragmentary and often unreliable evidence provided by external sources. The question of whether modern technology could ever fully compensate for the loss of the Nalanda library is a question that deserves serious consideration. Digital databases, artificial intelligence, and computational textual analysis have transformed the study of Buddhist texts in ways that would have been unimaginable even a few decades ago. The ability to search vast corpora of text for specific terms, to identify patterns of intertextual reference, and to compare translations across multiple languages has opened new avenues of research that have already produced significant results. But these technological advances, however impressive, cannot create knowledge that has been destroyed. They can help us to organize, to analyze, and to interpret the knowledge that survives, but they cannot replace the knowledge that was consumed by the fire of 1193. The fundamental limitation of all recovery efforts, whether technological or traditional, is that they can only work with what exists. The manuscripts that burned at Nalanda do not exist. The knowledge they contained is gone. No technology, however advanced, can recreate knowledge that has been destroyed beyond all possibility of recovery. The comparison with other efforts to recover lost knowledge is instructive. The recovery of ancient Greek literature from medieval Arabic translations, which enabled European scholars to reclaim the philosophical and scientific heritage of the classical world, is often cited as an example of successful intellectual recovery. But the Greek case is different from the Nalanda case in important ways. The Greek texts that were recovered from Arabic translation had been deliberately selected for translation because of their recognized value, and they were translated by scholars who understood their content and who could ensure the accuracy of the translation. The texts that survived at Nalanda were also selected for translation, but the selection was more haphazard, driven by the particular interests of individual translators and by the particular circumstances of their visits to India. The result is that the Nalanda survivals are less systematic and less representative than the Greek survivals, making the task of reconstructing the original corpus more difficult and more uncertain. The mathematical scale of the loss continues to resist comprehension. If we attempt to estimate the total number of words contained in the Nalanda library, even using conservative assumptions about the number of manuscripts and the average length of each manuscript, the result is a figure that runs into the billions of words. The surviving Buddhist literary tradition, vast as it is, represents only a small fraction of this total. The disproportion between what was preserved and what was lost is one of the defining facts of Asian intellectual history, and it shapes our understanding of the Buddhist philosophical tradition in ways that are often invisible but that are always present. The particular tragedy of the Nalanda destruction is that it occurred at a time when the Indian Buddhist intellectual tradition was still actively producing new knowledge. The destruction did not come at the end of a period of intellectual decline. It came in the midst of a period of vigorous intellectual activity, when scholars at Nalanda and the other Indian monasteries were still producing original philosophical works, still engaging in productive debates with their Hindu and Jain counterparts, and still attracting students from across the Asian continent. The tradition was cut short, not exhausted. This distinction between a tradition that is exhausted and a tradition that is cut short is crucial for understanding the nature of the loss. An exhausted tradition, one that has produced everything it is capable of producing, and that has nothing more to say, can be lost without significant intellectual consequence, because its contributions have already been absorbed into the broader intellectual heritage. But a tradition that is cut short, one that still has productive work to do, and that is capable of making further contributions to human knowledge, represents a loss of unrealized potential, a loss of knowledge that could have been created, but never was. The specific philosophical debates that were occurring at Nalanda in the centuries before its destruction provide evidence for the continuing vitality of the tradition. The debates between the Madhyamaka and the Yogacara schools, which had been going on for centuries, and which had produced some of the most sophisticated philosophical arguments in the history of Buddhist thought, were still active and still productive in the 11th and 12th centuries. The debates between Buddhist and Hindu logicians, which had driven both traditions to increasingly refined levels of logical analysis, were also still ongoing. The tantric traditions, which were producing new texts and new practices at a rapid pace, were among the most dynamic elements of the Nalanda intellectual landscape in the final centuries before the destruction. The loss of this ongoing intellectual activity, this unfinished conversation between competing philosophical schools, is qualitatively different from the loss of completed works that had already made their contributions to the intellectual heritage. It is the loss of a future, the loss of philosophical insights that were in the process of being developed, but that were never completed, arguments that were being formulated but never finished, questions that were being asked but never answered. This is the most haunting dimension of the Nalanda tragedy, not just what was lost, but what might have been. Everything we have discussed so far concerns the specific texts that were lost, the specific channels through which some of those texts survived, and the specific efforts that scholars have made to recover and reconstruct the intellectual heritage of Nalanda. These are important matters, and the work of recovery is ongoing and vital. But beneath these specifics lies a deeper truth, a truth that concerns not just what was lost at Nalanda, but what the loss tells us about the nature of knowledge, the fragility of civilization, and the relationship between intellectual achievement and political power. The deeper truth is this: the destruction of Nalanda was not merely the burning of a library, it was the severing of a living intellectual tradition, a tradition that had been sustained for over 1,500 years by a continuous chain of teachers and students, a chain in which each generation received the accumulated wisdom of its predecessors, added its own contributions, and passed the whole to the next generation. The manuscripts that burned in the Dharma Ganja were the physical records of that tradition, but the tradition itself was more than its physical records. It was a living thing, embodied in the minds and the practices of the scholars who constituted the Nalanda community. When those scholars were killed or scattered, the tradition was broken, and the break was irreparable. This is not science fiction. This is a documented historical fact, and its consequences can be traced across the entire subsequent history of Asian intellectual life. The destruction of Nalanda and the other great Indian monasteries effectively ended the production of new Buddhist philosophical and scientific literature in India. The tradition that had produced Nagarjuna, Asanga, Vasubandhu, Dharmakirti, Shantideva, and dozens of other major thinkers simply stopped. The living stream of intellectual activity that had been flowing for over 1,500 years was dammed, and the waters dispersed into 1,000 smaller channels that could never reconstitute the full force of the original current. The impact on Tibet was particularly significant. Tibetan Buddhism had depended on India as its primary source of new texts, new teachers, and new intellectual stimulation. The destruction of the Indian monasteries cut off this supply at a critical moment in Tibetan Buddhist history. The Tibetan tradition had been receiving a steady flow of translated texts and visiting scholars from India for centuries, and this flow had been essential for the development and the vitality of Tibetan Buddhist thought. When the flow stopped, the Tibetan tradition was forced to turn inward, to work with the texts it had already received, and to develop its own independent scholarly tradition based on the Indian materials it had accumulated. The result was a Tibetan Buddhist philosophical tradition that is rich, sophisticated, and deeply rooted in Indian sources, but that is also, inevitably, a tradition shaped by the accident of which texts happen to have been translated before the destruction of the Indian originals. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the permanence of knowledge. We tend to think of great intellectual traditions as self-sustaining, as systems that, once established, will continue to produce new knowledge and new insight indefinitely. The example of Nalanda shows that this assumption is false. The Indian Buddhist intellectual tradition was one of the most productive, most creative, and most enduring intellectual traditions in human history. It had been producing original work for over 1,500 years. It had generated philosophical systems of extraordinary depth and sophistication. It had attracted the finest minds from across an entire continent, and it was destroyed in a single generation by a military force that had no interest in the knowledge it was destroying and no understanding of its significance. The loss extends beyond the specific texts that were destroyed to the broader intellectual ecosystem that had sustained their production. The destruction of Nalanda did not merely remove a library from the world. It removed a university, a community of scholars, a system of patronage, a network of monastic institutions, and a tradition of intellectual exchange that had connected India to the rest of the Buddhist world for centuries. These institutional and social structures were, in many ways, more important than the manuscripts themselves, because they were the structures that produced the manuscripts, that trained the scholars who wrote them, that provided the economic support that allowed scholarly work to continue, and that maintained the networks of communication through which ideas and texts circulated across the vast distances of the Asian continent. Let that sink in. The burning of the library was the most visible and the most dramatic aspect of the destruction, but it was not the most important. The most important aspect was the destruction of the living tradition that the library served. A library can be rebuilt if the knowledge it contains exists in other forms, and if the community that uses it survives. But the community that used the Nalanda library did not survive. The scholars were killed or scattered. The students fled. The institutional framework collapsed. And the living tradition that had sustained the production of new knowledge for over 1,500 years came to an end. The destruction of Nalanda also raises profound questions about the relationship between knowledge and power. The Nalanda library existed because it was supported by powerful patrons, the Gupta and Pala dynasties, who provided the economic resources and the political protection that the institution needed to survive. When those patrons declined in power and were replaced by rulers who did not share their commitment to the support of Buddhist learning, the institution became vulnerable. The burning of Nalanda was, in one sense, a failure of patronage, a failure of the political and economic systems that had sustained the institution to continue providing the protection and the resources it needed. This pattern, the dependence of great intellectual institutions on political patronage, and the vulnerability of those institutions when patronage is withdrawn or when political circumstances change, is one of the recurring themes in the history of knowledge. The Library of Alexandria declined when the Ptolemaic dynasty's interest in scholarship waned, and when the political stability of Egypt was disrupted by Roman conquest and civil conflict. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was destroyed when the Mongols conquered the city in 1258. The monasteries of medieval Europe were vulnerable to Viking raids, peasant revolts, and the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. In each case, the intellectual institution was embedded in a political and economic system that sustained it, and the disruption of that system led to the destruction or the decline of the institution. The deeper truth about Nalanda is that it reveals the essential fragility of all human knowledge. Knowledge is not a substance that, once created, exists independently of the human beings who produce, preserve, and transmit it. Knowledge is a process, a continuous activity of creation, preservation, and transmission that requires human effort, human institutions, and human resources to sustain. When the effort stops, when the institutions are destroyed, when the resources are withdrawn, the knowledge does not simply persist in some disembodied form. It decays, it fragments, it is lost. The manuscripts deteriorate, the memories fade, the traditions are broken, and the knowledge that was once the common possession of an entire civilization becomes the fragmentary, uncertain, and incomplete inheritance of those who come after. The modern world's encounter with the legacy of Nalanda has been shaped by the circumstances of that encounter. The ruins of Nalanda were rediscovered in the 19th century, during the period of British colonial rule in India, and the early archaeological investigations were conducted within the framework of colonial scholarship, which tended to view Indian civilization through a European lens and to evaluate Indian intellectual achievements by European standards. The result was a body of scholarship that, while often impressive in its technical quality, sometimes failed to appreciate the full significance of the Indian intellectual tradition on its own terms. The Buddhist philosophical tradition, in particular, was often misunderstood or undervalued by European scholars who approached it with the assumptions and the categories of Western philosophy, assumptions and categories that did not always fit the Indian material. The recovery of the Nalanda legacy has been further complicated by the political circumstances of the modern era. The partition of India and Pakistan in 1947, the Chinese occupation of Tibet in 1950, and the subsequent destruction of Tibetan monasteries during the Cultural Revolution all disrupted the networks of Buddhist scholarship that might have facilitated the study and the recovery of the Nalanda tradition. Tibetan refugees who fled to India after 1959 brought with them manuscripts and oral traditions that preserve important elements of the Indian Buddhist heritage, and the Tibetan exile community has become one of the most important custodians of the Nalanda legacy. But the dispersal of the Tibetan scholarly community and the destruction of many Tibetan monastic libraries have added further layers of loss and fragmentation to a tradition that had already suffered catastrophic damage in the 12th century. The reopening of Nalanda University in 2014 as a modern international institution dedicated to the revival of learning at the ancient site represents a symbolic attempt to reconnect with the lost tradition. The new university, which operates under the auspices of the Indian government and an international consortium of Asian nations, cannot recreate the intellectual community that was destroyed 8 centuries ago. But it can serve as a reminder that the tradition existed, that it mattered, and that the values it embodied, the commitment to learning, to debate, to the free exchange of ideas across cultural and national boundaries, are values that the modern world continues to need. This is not science fiction. This is the real history of a real institution, an institution that was, for 700 years, the greatest centre of learning in Asia, and whose destruction represents one of the most devastating losses of knowledge in the history of human civilization. The fire that consumed the Dharmaganja burned not only manuscripts, but also the living memory of a tradition that had been accumulating wisdom for over 1,500 years. The smoke that rose above the plains of Bihar in 1193 carried with it the ashes of knowledge that can never be fully recovered, knowledge that we can sense in the gaps and the silences of the surviving Buddhist literary tradition, but that we can never again read, study, or understand in its fullness. The concept of shifting baseline syndrome, borrowed from ecology, is useful for understanding the impact of the Nalanda destruction on subsequent Buddhist intellectual history. Shifting baseline syndrome occurs when each new generation accepts the degraded state of the environment it inherits as normal, having no memory of the richer environment that existed before. In the context of the Nalanda legacy, shifting baseline syndrome manifests in the way that later Buddhist communities, particularly in Tibet, accepted the reduced corpus of available Indian Buddhist texts as representing the full extent of the tradition, having no direct experience of the vastly larger body of literature that had existed before the destruction. The Tibetan scholars who inherited the translated Indian texts were brilliant, creative, and deeply devoted to the tradition they had received. They produced commentaries, syntheses, and original philosophical works that are among the finest achievements of the Buddhist intellectual tradition. But they worked within the boundaries set by the texts that had been translated before the destruction, and they had no way of knowing what had been lost. The result is a Tibetan Buddhist tradition that is, in a sense, a garden grown from a limited selection of seeds, a garden that is rich and beautiful, but that does not reflect the full diversity of the original landscape from which the seeds were gathered. The impact of the destruction on the study of Indian Buddhist medicine is a case in point. The Nalanda curriculum included the study of Ayurvedic medicine, and the library contained medical texts that represented centuries of clinical observation and therapeutic practice. Some of these texts survived in Tibetan translation, and they became the foundation of the Tibetan medical tradition, which developed its own distinctive character while remaining deeply rooted in the Indian Ayurvedic heritage. But the medical texts that survived in translation represent only a fraction of the medical literature that was available at Nalanda, and the loss of the remaining texts means that aspects of the Indian medical tradition that were not translated are permanently beyond recovery. The impact on the study of Indian Buddhist art and architecture is similarly significant. The Nalanda campus was decorated with sculptures and paintings that represented some of the finest achievements of Buddhist art in India. The artistic tradition of the Pala period, which is associated with Nalanda and the other great monasteries of Bihar and Bengal, produced works of extraordinary beauty and sophistication that influenced the development of Buddhist art across Asia, from Tibet to Java. The destruction of Nalanda and the other Pala period monasteries resulted in the loss of most of the artistic heritage of this tradition, leaving only the works that were preserved in stone, in bronze, and in the artistic traditions of other Asian countries that had been influenced by the Pala style. The philosophical implications of the loss are perhaps the most profound. The Buddhist philosophical tradition at Nalanda had reached a level of sophistication that invited comparison with the greatest philosophical traditions of any civilization. The Madhyamaka analysis of emptiness, the Yogacara analysis of consciousness, the Pramana tradition's analysis of valid knowledge, and the Vajrayana tradition's integration of philosophy with meditative practice represented a body of philosophical thought that was original, rigorous, and deeply engaged with the most fundamental questions of human existence. The loss of a significant portion of this philosophical literature means that our understanding of the Buddhist philosophical tradition is necessarily incomplete, shaped by the accident of which texts happened to be translated before the destruction and which were lost. The loss of the oral traditions is perhaps even more significant than the loss of the manuscripts. The Indian Buddhist tradition placed enormous emphasis on the direct transmission of knowledge from teacher to student, a transmission that supplemented and contextualized the written texts. The senior scholars at Nalanda possessed not only the knowledge contained in the manuscripts, but also the oral commentaries, the debating techniques, the meditation instructions, and the pedagogical methods that had been transmitted from teacher to student for generations. This oral tradition was, in many ways, the living heart of the intellectual tradition, the dimension of knowledge that could not be captured in writing, and that could only be transmitted through personal contact between a qualified teacher and a prepared student. When the teachers of Nalanda were killed or scattered, this oral tradition was shattered, and the fragments that survived in the memories of refugee scholars could never fully reconstitute the whole. The comparison with other major losses of knowledge in human history helps to put the destruction of Nalanda in perspective. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, which is the most famous example of knowledge destruction in Western history, resulted in the loss of a collection that, while vast, was primarily composed of texts in Greek and Egyptian that represented the literary heritage of a single, albeit important, cultural tradition. The destruction of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad in 1258 resulted in the loss of a collection that included texts in Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Syriac, representing the accumulated wisdom of the Islamic Golden Age. The destruction of Nalanda resulted in the loss of a collection that included texts in Sanskrit, Pali, and various Prakrit dialects, representing the accumulated wisdom of over 1,500 years of Buddhist and Indian intellectual activity. In terms of sheer scale, the Nalanda destruction may represent the single greatest loss of knowledge in the history of human civilization. The loss is compounded by the fact that many of the ideas and insights contained in the destroyed texts may have been genuinely original, representing contributions to human knowledge that cannot be reconstructed from other sources. The Buddhist philosophers at Nalanda were not merely summarizing or commenting on earlier ideas. They were producing original philosophical work, developing new arguments, exploring new problems, and reaching new conclusions that had never been articulated before. When their manuscripts burned, the specific formulations, the specific arguments, and the specific insights they contained were lost, and no amount of reconstruction from other sources can fully replace them. The destruction of Nalanda invites a broader reflection on the relationship between political power and intellectual freedom. The Nalanda tradition flourished because it was supported by rulers who valued learning and who were willing to invest substantial resources in the maintenance of intellectual institutions. The tradition was destroyed because the political order that had sustained it was replaced by a new order that did not share its commitment to the support of Buddhist scholarship. The lesson is clear. Intellectual institutions are not self-sustaining. They depend on the political and economic conditions of the societies in which they are embedded, and they are vulnerable to changes in those conditions. This lesson has implications for the modern world. The great universities and research institutions of the 21st century, like the monasteries of medieval India, depend on political stability, economic prosperity, and social commitment to the value of learning. They are sustained by public funding, private endowments, and the cultural conviction that the pursuit of knowledge is a worthy and a necessary activity. If any of these supports were to fail, if political instability were to disrupt the functioning of universities, if economic crisis were to reduce funding for research and education, if social attitudes were to shift away from the valuation of learning, the modern intellectual tradition would be at risk, just as the Buddhist intellectual tradition was at risk in 12th century India. The digital revolution has transformed the way knowledge is stored and transmitted, but it has not eliminated the fundamental vulnerabilities that the story of Nalanda illustrates. Digital storage is more compact and more easily reproduced than palm leaf manuscripts, but it is also more fragile in certain respects. Palm leaf manuscripts that escape fire and moisture can survive for centuries without any active intervention. Digital files, by contrast, require constant maintenance, constant updating, and constant investment in the infrastructure of servers, networks, and software that makes them accessible. A palm leaf manuscript buried in dry soil can be recovered centuries later and read by anyone who knows the language. A digital file stored on an obsolete medium or in an obsolete format may be unreadable within decades. The story of Nalanda also challenges the assumption that the modern world is immune to the kind of catastrophic knowledge loss that characterized earlier periods of human history. The concentration of knowledge in a small number of institutions, the dependence of those institutions on political and economic support, and the vulnerability of storage media to destruction or obsolescence are features of the modern intellectual landscape that parallel the conditions that made Nalanda vulnerable. The lesson of Nalanda is not that such losses are inevitable, but that they are possible, and that the prevention of such losses requires conscious, sustained, and collective effort. The story of Nalanda also forces us to reconsider the way we measure the value of knowledge. In the modern world, we tend to measure the value of knowledge in economic terms, asking what practical benefits it produces, what technological innovations it enables, what economic growth it generates. The Buddhist scholars at Nalanda measured the value of knowledge differently. For them, the highest form of knowledge was not knowledge that produced material benefits, but knowledge that alleviated suffering, that liberated the mind from ignorance and delusion, and that led to the enlightenment that is the ultimate goal of the Buddhist path. This different way of valuing knowledge produced a different kind of intellectual tradition, one that placed greater emphasis on the inner life of the mind, on the analysis of consciousness and perception, and on the cultivation of ethical and spiritual qualities, than on the development of technology or the accumulation of material wealth. The loss of this tradition is significant not only because of the specific texts and the specific ideas that were destroyed, but also because of the alternative model of intellectual life that it represented. The Nalanda tradition demonstrated that it was possible to sustain a vibrant, productive, and highly sophisticated intellectual community for 700 years on the basis of values that were fundamentally different from those that drive modern academic research. The loss of this demonstration, the erasure of this alternative model from the living memory of human civilization, is a loss that extends beyond the specific content of the destroyed manuscripts to the broader question of what kinds of intellectual life are possible, and what kinds of values can sustain them. The Nalanda tradition also produced important contributions to the study of logic that have influenced not only Buddhist philosophy, but also the broader history of ideas. The Buddhist logical tradition, developed by Dignaga and refined by Dharmakirti, constitutes one of the most sophisticated systems of formal reasoning produced in the pre-modern world. The Buddhist logicians developed a theory of inference that specified the conditions under which a conclusion could be validly drawn from premises, a theory of perception that analyzed the process by which the mind apprehends external objects, and a theory of meaning that explored the relationship between words and the things they signify. These contributions to the philosophy of logic and language are of interest not only to Buddhist scholars, but also to philosophers working in the Western analytic tradition, and they have been the subject of increasing scholarly attention in recent decades. The loss of the full corpus of Buddhist logical literature at Nalanda is particularly regrettable, because the logical tradition was one of the most dynamic and most productive areas of Buddhist philosophical inquiry in the centuries before the destruction. The Buddhist logicians were engaged in a continuous dialogue with the logicians of the Hindu Nyaya tradition, and this dialogue produced a series of increasingly sophisticated arguments and counter-arguments that pushed both traditions to higher levels of precision and rigor. The surviving texts from this dialogue provide a fascinating glimpse into a philosophical conversation of extraordinary quality, but they represent only a fraction of the total literature that the dialogue produced, and the full scope of the conversation can never be recovered. The interconnection between knowledge and spiritual practice in the Nalanda tradition adds another dimension to the understanding of what was lost. In the Buddhist tradition, knowledge is not merely intellectual, it is transformative. The study of philosophy, logic, and meditation at Nalanda was understood not merely as an academic exercise, but as a path of personal transformation, a means of cultivating the wisdom and the compassion that are the essential qualities of the enlightened mind. The texts that were produced at Nalanda were therefore not merely theoretical treatises, they were practical guides, maps of the inner landscape that were intended to help the practitioner navigate the journey from ignorance to enlightenment. The loss of these texts is therefore not merely an intellectual loss. It is a loss of practical wisdom, of specific techniques and specific methods for the cultivation of the mind that were developed over centuries of contemplative practice, and that may have been genuinely effective in producing the psychological and spiritual transformations that they described. The meditation manuals, in particular, represent a category of loss that is difficult to quantify, but that may be enormously significant. The Buddhist meditation tradition had developed, over the course of 15 centuries, a vast array of contemplative techniques, ranging from simple breathing exercises to complex visualization practices that involved the mental construction of elaborate symbolic environments. These techniques were described in meditation manuals that specified the procedures to be followed, the obstacles to be encountered, and the signs of progress to be expected at each stage of the practice. Many of these manuals survived in Tibetan translation, and they continue to be used by Tibetan Buddhist practitioners today, but many others were lost, and the specific techniques they described, developed over centuries of contemplative experimentation, are gone. The contemplative traditions of modern Buddhism are built on the foundations that survived the destruction, but they cannot draw on the full range of meditative technologies that the Nalanda tradition had developed, because the manuals describing many of those technologies were consumed by the fire. The relationship between the destruction of Nalanda and the broader history of knowledge loss in human civilization reveals a pattern that is deeply troubling. The destruction of great libraries and centers of learning is not an aberration. It is a recurring feature of human history, a pattern that manifests across different civilizations, different centuries, and different continents. From the burning of the Library of Alexandria to the sack of Baghdad, from the dissolution of the English monasteries to the destruction of Tibetan libraries during the Cultural Revolution, the pattern repeats itself with a consistency that suggests something fundamental about the relationship between political power and intellectual achievement. Intellectual institutions are created during periods of political stability and cultural investment. They are destroyed during periods of political upheaval and cultural transformation. The cycle is not inevitable, but it is persistent, and understanding it is essential for any serious effort to protect the intellectual heritage of the present from the destructive forces that have claimed so many of the achievements of the past. The recognition that the Nalanda tradition produced philosophical work of a quality and a sophistication that bears comparison with the finest achievements of Western philosophy has been one of the most important developments in modern comparative philosophy. The work of scholars such as Fyodor Szczepatsky, Edward Conze, Karl Potter, and more recently Mark Sideritz, J. Garfield, and Tom Tillemans has demonstrated that the Buddhist philosophical tradition, and particularly the tradition represented by the scholars of Nalanda, addresses many of the same questions that have occupied Western philosophers, including questions about the nature of perception, the foundations of knowledge, the structure of logical inference, and the relationship between language and reality. The recognition of these parallels has opened new avenues for philosophical dialogue between the Buddhist and the Western traditions, a dialogue that has the potential to enrich both traditions and to advance the shared human project of understanding the world and our place in it. The fact that this dialogue is based on an incomplete and fragmentary record of the Buddhist philosophical tradition is a source of both frustration and inspiration. Frustration, because we know that the full body of Buddhist philosophical literature would provide far richer material for comparative study than the fraction that survives. Inspiration, because the quality and the sophistication of the surviving material suggests that the full tradition must have been even more impressive, and because the ongoing work of recovery and translation continues to expand the body of available material, making the dialogue richer and more productive with each new discovery. What does the destruction of Nalanda mean for our understanding of the human intellectual heritage? What does it tell us about the fragility of knowledge, the role of institutions in the preservation of learning, and the responsibilities of the present generation toward the achievements of the past? The first implication is a recognition of the catastrophic asymmetry between the time it takes to build knowledge and the time it takes to destroy it. The Nalanda library was 700 years in the making. It was destroyed in a matter of weeks. The Buddhist intellectual tradition that the library served was over 1500 years old. It was ended in a single generation. The disproportion between the effort of creation and the ease of destruction is one of the most sobering facts about human civilization. It takes centuries to build a tradition of learning. It takes a single army, a single fire, a single moment of political upheaval to destroy one. This asymmetry is not merely a historical observation. It is a warning. The institutions that sustain learning in the modern world, the universities, the libraries, the research centers, the publishing houses, the digital archives, are no less vulnerable to disruption than the monasteries of medieval India. They depend on political stability, economic prosperity, and social commitment to the value of learning. When any of these conditions fails, the institutions become vulnerable, and the knowledge they contain is at risk. The burning of Nalanda is not merely a tragedy of the past. It is a template for tragedies that could occur in the future, in any society that takes for granted the institutions that preserve and transmit its intellectual heritage. The second implication is a recognition of the interconnectedness of the world's intellectual traditions. The destruction of Nalanda did not merely affect Indian Buddhism, it affected the entire Buddhist world, from Tibet to Japan, from Sri Lanka to Indonesia. The ideas that were produced at Nalanda had travelled along the trade routes and the pilgrimage paths of Asia for centuries, shaping the philosophical, religious, and artistic traditions of dozens of cultures and hundreds of millions of people. The loss of the Nalanda library was therefore not a local event. It was a global one, a loss that diminished the intellectual heritage of the entire Asian continent and, by extension, of all humanity. The recognition of this interconnectedness should change the way we think about the preservation of knowledge. The texts that were lost at Nalanda were not merely Indian texts. They were contributions to a human conversation about the nature of reality, the foundations of knowledge, the meaning of suffering, and the possibility of liberation that has been ongoing for thousands of years, and that continues to this day. The loss of those contributions diminishes the conversation, narrows its range, and reduces the diversity of perspectives available to those who participate in it. Every text that was lost at Nalanda is a voice silenced in a conversation that is poorer for its absence. There is a pause worth taking here. Think about the monks who spent their lives in the scriptoria of Nalanda, copying manuscripts by hand onto palm leaves that they knew would eventually deteriorate and would need to be copied again by future monks. These were people who understood, in a way that most of us do not, that the preservation of knowledge is not a passive activity. It is an active, ongoing, and never-ending process that requires constant effort and constant attention. Every manuscript that they copied was an act of faith in the future, a bet that the tradition they served would continue, that future generations of monks would continue the work of copying, that the chain of transmission would remain unbroken. They were wrong about the outcome, but they were right about the principle. Knowledge does not preserve itself. It must be preserved by human effort, and that effort must be sustained, generation after generation, without interruption. The third implication is a challenge to the way we think about the relationship between religious and secular knowledge. The Nalanda Library was a monastic institution, and the scholars who worked there were, for the most part, Buddhist monks who understood their intellectual work as a form of religious practice. But the knowledge they produced was not merely religious knowledge. It included logic, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, grammar, and the arts, fields that we would today classify as secular. The distinction between religious and secular knowledge, which seems natural and obvious to modern Western thinkers, did not apply at Nalanda. The Buddhist scholars understood all knowledge as interconnected, as part of a unified project of understanding the world and alleviating the suffering of sentient beings. The loss of the Nalanda Library was therefore not merely a loss of religious texts. It was a loss of the entire spectrum of human knowledge as it was understood and practiced in the Buddhist intellectual tradition. The modern response to the loss of Nalanda must include a commitment to the preservation of what survives. The manuscripts that escaped the destruction, preserved in Tibetan, Chinese, and Nepalese collections, represent a priceless intellectual inheritance that requires ongoing conservation, study, and publication. The work of translating these texts into modern languages, of studying them in their historical and philosophical context, and of making them available to scholars and students around the world is not merely an academic exercise. It is an act of cultural preservation, a continuation of the work that the Nalanda monks began over 1,000 years ago when they first sat down to copy the manuscripts that would become the library's collection. The vulnerability of knowledge is not a problem of the past, it is a problem of the present. Digital storage, for all its convenience and its capacity, is not permanent. Hard drives fail, servers crash, file formats become obsolete, cloud services are discontinued. The institutions that maintain digital archives require constant funding, constant updating, and constant attention. The lesson of Nalanda is that no storage medium, no institution, and no civilization is immune to the forces of destruction. Whether those forces take the form of a conquering army, a natural disaster, or the slow, insidious decay of institutional neglect, the preservation of knowledge requires not just technology but commitment, not just infrastructure but will, not just storage but the sustained determination to ensure that what has been learned by one generation is available to the next. The story of Nalanda also raises questions about the responsibility of the present to the past. The monks who built and maintained the Nalanda Library did so in the belief that the knowledge they were preserving was of lasting value, that it would benefit not only their own generation but also all future generations. They were right about the value. The philosophical, scientific, and literary achievements of the Nalanda tradition are among the most important contributions to human knowledge in the history of civilization. But they were wrong about the permanence. The knowledge they preserved so carefully was destroyed in a matter of weeks, and much of it has been lost forever. The modern response to this loss must include not only the preservation and the study of what survives, but also a broader commitment to the protection of the world's intellectual heritage from the forces that threaten it. The digitization of Buddhist manuscripts, the conservation of palm leaf and birch bark documents, the training of new generations of scholars in Sanskrit, Tibetan, and the other languages of the Buddhist literary tradition, and the publication of critical editions and translations of surviving texts are all essential components of this effort, but they are not sufficient. The deeper response must be a recognition that the preservation of knowledge is not merely a technical problem, but a moral one, a recognition that the knowledge we have inherited from the past is a trust, held on behalf of future generations, and that the failure to preserve it is a proof of that trust. The environmental dimension of the loss deserves mention. The palm leaf manuscripts of the Nalanda library were made from the leaves of tropical palms that grew abundantly in the warm, humid climate of Bihar. The choice of palm leaf as a writing medium was dictated by the local environment, and it produced manuscripts that were elegant, compact, and well suited to the conditions in which they were produced. But palm leaf manuscripts are also fragile, vulnerable to moisture, insects, and fire, and they require regular copying to ensure their survival. The tropical climate that made palm leaves readily available also made their preservation difficult, creating a constant tension between production and decay that the Nalanda scribes managed through their continuous program of manuscript copying. When that program was interrupted by the destruction of the institution, the manuscripts that survived the fire were exposed to the forces of tropical decay without the protective intervention of the scribal community, and they quickly deteriorated beyond recovery. The story of Nalanda reminds us that the preservation of knowledge is not merely a matter of good intentions. It is a matter of sustained institutional effort, of continuous investment in the infrastructure of preservation, and of constant vigilance against the forces that threaten to destroy what has been so carefully created. The monks of Nalanda understood this. They devoted their lives to the preservation and the transmission of knowledge, working day after day, year after year, century after century, to ensure that the texts they had inherited would be available to future generations. They succeeded for 700 years. They might have succeeded for 700 more if the forces of history had allowed them to continue their work. But history did not allow it. The fire came, the manuscripts burned, and the silence descended. The loss of the Nalanda tradition raises a final unsettling question about the nature of progress itself. The modern world tends to assume that knowledge, once gained, is retained, that the overall trajectory of human intellectual history is one of steady accumulation and advancement. The story of Nalanda challenges this assumption. The Buddhist intellectual tradition at Nalanda was, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated and most productive intellectual traditions in human history. It had been developing for over 1,500 years. It had attracted the finest minds from across an entire continent. It had produced work of extraordinary quality in philosophy, logic, medicine, mathematics, and the arts. And it was destroyed in a single generation, its accumulated wisdom reduced to ash and silence. The lesson is clear. Progress is not inevitable. Knowledge is not self-preserving. The gains of one generation can be lost by the next. The intellectual achievements of entire civilizations can be erased from the record of human history by the forces of war, of political upheaval, of economic collapse, or of simple neglect. The story of Nalanda is a reminder that the preservation of knowledge requires constant effort, constant vigilance, and constant commitment, and that the failure to provide these things can result in losses that are permanent, irreversible, and devastating. The responsibility to preserve the surviving remnants of the Nalanda tradition falls on the present generation of scholars, librarians, conservators, and institutions that have inherited the fragments of the destroyed library. This responsibility is not merely academic, it is moral. The manuscripts that survive, whether in Tibetan, Chinese, Nepalese, or other collections, represent the last physical traces of one of the greatest intellectual traditions in human history. Their preservation, their study, and their publication are not optional activities. They are obligations, owed to the monks who created and maintained the Nalanda library, to the scholars whose works they contain, and to the future generations who will depend on them for their understanding of the Buddhist intellectual heritage. The preservation of what survives is not merely a scholarly project. It is a project of cultural justice, an acknowledgement that the intellectual achievements of the Buddhist tradition deserve the same respect, the same attention, and the same commitment to preservation that we accord to the intellectual achievements of the Western tradition. The ruins of Nalanda stand in the Indian state of Bihar, surrounded by green fields and small villages that give no hint of the vast university complex that once occupied the site. The brick foundations of the monasteries are still visible, laid out in neat rows that trace the outlines of buildings that once housed thousands of monks and students. The stumps of the temple towers rise above the excavated ruins, their carved surfaces worn by 8 centuries of wind and rain. The site is quiet now. The debates that once echoed through the lecture halls and the courtyards have long since fallen silent. The manuscripts that once filled the shelves of the Dharmaganja have been reduced to nothing, not even ash, just absence, an emptiness where knowledge once existed. The 3 great buildings of the library, the Ratnasagara, the Ratnadadi, and the Ratnaranjaka, are gone. No trace of them remains in the archaeological record. Their foundations, if they survive, are buried beneath layers of debris and soil that have accumulated over the centuries since the destruction. The fire that consumed them was so thorough, and the subsequent decay so complete, that even the physical outlines of the buildings have been lost. What remains is the memory, preserved in the accounts of the Chinese pilgrims, and in the scattered references of later writers, the memory of buildings that were said to be so tall that their upper floors touched the clouds, buildings that held within their walls the collected wisdom of an entire civilization. The monks who worked in those buildings, who copied manuscripts and taught students and debated philosophy and practiced meditation, are gone too. Their names, with a few exceptions, are unknown to us. They were not famous scholars whose works survived the destruction. They were the anonymous labourers of the intellectual tradition, the scribes and the librarians, and the junior teachers, whose daily work sustained the institution, and whose contributions, though individually modest, were collectively essential. Without them, the library could not have functioned. Without them, the tradition could not have been maintained. And without them, the knowledge that was lost at Nalanda could not have been created in the first place. The fire that consumed the library of Nalanda was not unique in the history of human civilization. Libraries have been burned before and since in Alexandria, in Baghdad, in Constantinople, in Nineveh, in the monasteries of Tibet, in the archives of colonized peoples around the world. The burning of books and manuscripts is one of the recurring tragedies of human history, a reminder that the forces of destruction are always stronger and always faster than the forces of creation and preservation. A manuscript that took months to copy can be reduced to ash in seconds. A library that took centuries to build can be destroyed in a day. The asymmetry is permanent and inescapable, and it places on every generation the responsibility to protect the knowledge it has inherited from the possibility of its destruction. The legacy of Nalanda lives on, diminished and fragmented, but not entirely extinguished. It lives in the Tibetan canon, where translations of Indian Buddhist texts preserved the philosophical and religious thought of the scholars who once taught in the lecture halls of Bihar. It lives in the Chinese canon, where the translations of Xuanzang and other pilgrims preserve works that might otherwise have been entirely lost. It lives in the scattered Sanskrit manuscripts that have survived in Nepal, in Central Asia, and in other locations where the favourable climate or the fortunate circumstances of history preserved what the fires of Bihar destroyed. And it lives in the continuing tradition of Buddhist scholarship, practiced today by scholars in universities and monasteries around the world, who study the surviving texts, translate them into new languages, and attempt to reconstruct the intellectual world that was destroyed 8 centuries ago. The story of Nalanda is a story about the value of knowledge and the cost of its loss. It is a story about the ambition and the dedication of the people who built the greatest library in Asia, who collected and preserved the wisdom of an entire civilization, who attracted the finest minds from across a continent, and who sustained a tradition of learning for 700 years. It is a story about the violence and the ignorance that destroyed what those people built, that burned what they preserved, and that silenced the voices that had spoken from those palm leaf manuscripts for generations. And it is a story about the slow, painstaking work of recovery, the work of scholars who travel to remote monasteries, who catalogue dusty manuscripts, who learn dead languages, and who piece together, fragment by fragment, the outlines of a tradition that was nearly lost forever. Every manuscript that survives is a victory. Every text that is identified, translated, and published is a small act of defiance against the forces that sought to destroy the Nalanda tradition. Every scholar who studies the Buddhist philosophical tradition, who reads the works of Nagarjuna or Dharmakirti or Shantideva, who engages with the arguments and the insights of the Nalanda masters, is continuing the conversation that the fire of 1193 tried to end. The conversation is diminished. Many of the voices are silent. Many of the arguments are lost. But the conversation continues, and as long as it continues, the legacy of Nalanda is not entirely gone. The ruins stand in the fields of Bihar, the palm leaves are ash, the debates are silent. But somewhere, in a monastery in Tibet, in a library in Tokyo, in a university in London or New York or Delhi, a scholar is reading a text that was once studied in the lecture halls of Nalanda. The words on the page are a translation, a copy of a copy of a copy, separated from the original by centuries and by thousands of miles. But the ideas are the same, the questions are the same. The search for understanding, for truth, for liberation from suffering is the same search that animated the monks of Nalanda 1,000 years ago. The fire destroyed the manuscripts. It did not destroy the questions they asked. And as long as those questions are still being asked, the spirit of Nalanda endures. The ruins stand, the questions remain, and the silence waits for an answer. The smoke has cleared over Bihar. The fire that burned for 6 months has been out for more than 800 years. The palm leaves are gone, the buildings are ruins, the monks are dust. But the tradition they built, the tradition of inquiry, of debate, of the tireless pursuit of truth, has not been entirely extinguished. It survives in the texts that escaped the fire, in the translations that were carried to Tibet and China and Japan, in the philosophical traditions that continue to draw on the insights of the Nalanda masters, and in the living practice of Buddhist communities around the world that trace their intellectual lineage, however distantly and however indirectly, to the scholars who once sat in the lecture halls and the libraries of the greatest university in Asia. The loss cannot be undone. The manuscripts that burned cannot be unburned. The knowledge that was destroyed cannot be recreated. But the work of recovery can continue. It must continue, because every text that is recovered, every manuscript that is preserved, every translation that is completed, is a small act of restoration, a partial filling of the void that the fire of 1193 created. The void will never be completely filled. The loss is too great, the destruction too thorough, the passage of time too long. But every act of recovery matters, because every act of recovery preserves a piece of the human heritage that would otherwise be lost. And because the cumulative effect of many small acts of recovery, sustained over many generations, can, in time, restore at least some of what was taken. Every manuscript that was copied at Nalanda was an act of hope. Every text that was studied, debated, and transmitted was an affirmation that the pursuit of understanding matters, that the questions we ask about the nature of reality, the foundations of knowledge, and the meaning of human existence are worth asking, and that the answers, however partial and however provisional, are worth preserving. The fire that consumed the library of Nalanda destroyed the physical records of that affirmation, but it did not destroy the affirmation itself. The questions that the Nalanda scholars asked are still being asked. The insights they gained, preserved in the translations and the traditions that survived the destruction, are still being studied. And the commitment to learning that animated their work, the conviction that knowledge is precious and that its preservation is a sacred duty, is still alive in the scholars and the institutions that carry on their legacy. The ruins of Nalanda are quiet now. The debates have fallen silent. The manuscripts are gone. But the questions that animated the intellectual life of the institution, the questions about the nature of consciousness, the foundations of knowledge, the meaning of suffering, and the possibility of liberation, these questions have not been answered, and they have not been forgotten. They echo through the corridors of every university, every monastery, and every library in the world where the legacy of the Nalanda tradition is studied and preserved. The fire destroyed the manuscripts. It did not destroy the need to understand.